Hello and thank you for joining for tonight's stories. I hope you enjoy. The Wapiti Protocol. Tell me again why we're trusting a guy who thinks Bigfoot owes him child support, Kessler muttered, fumbling with the straps of his tactical vest. The bunker's fluorescence buzzed overhead, casting everyone in a sickly blue pallor. Corporal Vega didn't even look up from her rifle, because Shaw's the only one who's made it out of the Wapiti alive. Twice. Project Lead Rayner tapped the monitor, freezing the grainy footage on a skeletal figure, too tall, too jointed, loping between pines. Its antlers scraped the canopy. This is from the hiker's GoPro. Audio picked up his last words before, well. He hit play. A wet, ragged scream filled the room, then silence. The rookie paled. Okay, but learning, Wendigos don't learn. Rayner ejected the memory card with a click. They do now. He slid a topographic map across the steel table, its edges frayed from too many unfoldings. A red X marked the collapsed mine shaft where the hiker's GPS had last transmitted. Shaw's theory is they're adapting, not just hunting, studying us. Sergeant Dawes traced the contour lines with a calloused finger. Like the Piedmont incident. The name landed like a corpse hitting concrete. Vega's jaw tightened. Even Kessler stopped fidgeting. The overhead lights flickered. Rayner cleared his throat. Standard protocol applies, silver filament nets, UV flares, sedatives at triple dosage. But if it mimics voices, he hesitated, then passed out earpieces. Filter 7.2 cuts out anything resembling human speech. Kessler held his up to the light like a dubious jeweler. So we just ignore it if it starts quoting Shakespeare. The hum of the helicopter blades drowned out Kessler's next smartass remark, which Shaw counted as a mercy. Through the open bay door, the Wapiti sprawled below, a sea of pines so dense they looked like fur. Vega checked her harness for the 12th time, fingers twitching near the flare gun strapped to her thigh. Drop zone in 30, the pilot barked over comms. Dawes stood, his frame blocking the shuddering light. Earpieces in. Last chance to piss yourself, Kessler. The rookie flipped him off, but Shaw saw the way his throat bobbed when he swallowed. Wind roared as they fast-stroked down. Shaw hit the ground, rolling, pine needles sticking to his gloves. The forest was wrong, not just quiet, but hollow, like something had sucked the life out and left the husk. No birds, no insects, just the creak of branches rubbing together in a breeze that didn't exist. Kessler stumbled into a clearing, his boot catching on something. He yanked it free, a length of intestine half buried in the dirt. Oh God! Vega nudged it with her rifle. Predators usually scatter the remains. Shaw didn't say what they were all thinking. Nothing out here hunts like an animal. Shaw's earpiece crackled to life, just static at first, then a voice. Not Dawes, not Vega's. Something wrong, syllables stretched thin like taffy. Help me, it whispered, and Shaw ripped the earpiece out before the rest could follow. Kessler gagged beside him, hands braced on his knees. Jesus was that. Don't, Vega chambered around, her knuckles white. It's bait. The GPS blinked erratically. Shaw smacked it and the screen resolved into a single pulsing dot, the mine shaft, 500 yards northeast. Dawes signaled advance, his rifle sweeping the tree line. Pine boughs sagged under the weight of something that wasn't snow. Shaw didn't look up. Shaw's boots sank into the spongy earth with a sound like wet paper tearing. The air reeked of spoiled meat and damp fur, but it was the silence that clawed at his ribs. No wind, no rustle, just the occasional snap of a branch too far ahead to be natural. Vega moved like a shadow at his flank, her rifle's barrel tracing the gaps between trees where the light didn't reach. Kessler's breath hitched behind them. Did you? A click high above where the pine needles knitted into a suffocating canopy. Shaw froze, his thumb hovering over the UV flare's trigger. The noise repeated, not a branch, not an animal, deliberate, like a tongue tapping against teeth. Dawes' voice crackled in Shaw's earpiece, stripped of warmth by the filter. Movement, 11 o'clock. Shaw didn't turn his head. He let his eyes slide left slow like oil over glass. Between the pines, something pale shifted, not walking but unfolding, limbs too long for the space between trunks. It paused, head cocked at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. The flare's plastic casing creaked in Shaw's grip. Vega's boot scuffed dirt, a warning. The thing's head snapped toward the sound, antlers scraping bark. Shaw's earpiece fizzed, Dawes' voice tight, hold. Kessler's rifle clattered against a rock. The Wendigo moved. The flare burst from Vega's gun before Shaw could blink, flooding the clearing with searing violet light. For half a heartbeat, the Wendigo was pinned in the glare, ribs like a ship's hull, antlers splayed like dead branches, its mouth a wet black pit stretching too wide. Then it twisted, folding backward into the trees with a sound like tearing canvas. Kessler's scream didn't make it past his teeth. The thing landed on him in a tangle of limbs, its fingers, too many joints, too long, curling around his throat. Shaw's dart gun came up, but Dawes was already firing, silver-tipped rounds punching through the creature's torso. It shrieked, a noise like ice cracking underfoot, and hurled Kessler into the underbrush. "Nets!" Dawes barked, but Vega was already moving, the reinforced mesh unfurling between them like a spider's web. The Wendigo lunged, not at them, but over, its antlers shearing through pine boughs as it cleared the trap in one fluid leap. Shaw caught a glimpse of its eyes, pupilless and gleaming like wet quartz, before it vanished into the tree line. Silence, then Kessler's wet, gurgling breaths. Vega was on Kessler before the last wheeze left his lungs. She tore open his vest, fingers slick with blood as she pressed a gauze pad to the ragged tear in his throat. "Pressure here," she snapped, grabbing Shaw's wrist and shoving his hand over the wound. Kessler's lips moved soundlessly, his eyes wide and unblinking. The gauze soaked through in seconds. Dawes' boot crunched pine needles as he circled them, rifle trained on the tree line. "We need to move. Now." His voice was flat the way it got when things were bad enough to skip the cursing. Shaw's earpiece fizzed, a burst of static, then a whisper. "Hurt." Vega's head jerked up. She'd heard it too. The Wendigo didn't attack. It watched from the shadows, its breath a slow, rhythmic click against the trees. Shaw's fingers twitched toward the flare gun. "It's hurting us," he muttered. Kessler's blood seeped between Shaw's fingers, warm and insistent. The gauze was a lost cause, just another piece of red-soaked debris in this god-forsaken forest. Vega's hands trembled as she jammed a fresh bandage against the wound, her lips pressed into a thin white line. Kessler's eyes rolled back, his breath coming in shallow hitches. Shaw knew that rhythm. It was the same one his old partner had before the medics zipped the body bag shut. Dawes' boot nudged Shaw's thigh. "Leave him." The words were ice-cold, pragmatic. "It's using him as bait." Shaw's grip tightened. Kessler's carotid pulsed weakly against his palm. "Not yet." The clicking intensified, not just from the tree line now, but from above, from behind, a chorus of wet snaps that circled them like vultures. Vega's flare gun swung wildly, the UV beam cutting through the gloom to reveal glimpses of emaciated limbs retreating just beyond its reach. "They're communicating," she hissed. The flare's violet beam trembled in Vega's grip as it swept across the tree line, catching the glint of something pale and segmented retreating into the shadows. Kessler's breath hitched wetly beneath Shaw's fingers, each exhale flecking his lips with blood. Dawes' boot crushed a pinecone as he pivoted, his rifle's laser sight painting a red dot on the swaying branches. "They're flanking." His voice was gravel wrapped in barbed wire. Shaw didn't need to see the sergeant's face to know his expression, that same flat, dead stare he'd worn when they'd pulled what was left of Martinez from the Piedmont tunnels. A new sound cut through the clicking, a wet, rhythmic shuck-shuck-shuck like a butcher's knife through gristle. Shaw's earpiece fizzed. "So cold," whispered a voice that wasn't H-Sue's but wore her vowels like ill-fitting skin. Vega's trigger finger twitched. The Wendigo struck from the ground this time, not the antlered one but a smaller, spindlier thing that scuttled on all fours like a gutted deer. It lunged for Dawes' flank, jaws unhinging with a pop of cartilage. Shaw's dart gun barked first, the sedative punching through its clavicle. The creature spasmed mid-leap, its gangly limbs tangling as it crashed into the underbrush. The sedative should have dropped it instantly. Instead, the Wendigo writhed, not in pain but in calculation, its two long fingers digging grooves into the soil like it was memorizing the texture. Vega's flare gun swung toward it, but Dawes grabbed her wrist. "Don't," he hissed. "Look at its pupils." Shaw barely caught it. The way the creature's black, glassy eyes contracted under the UV beam, adjusting faster than human reflexes could. The dart's dosage was enough to kill an elephant. This thing was still thinking. Kessler's breath stuttered. Shaw pressed harder on his throat, feeling the hot pulse of blood slow to a trickle. "Hang on, kid." The lie tasted like copper. Above them, branches groaned under sudden weight. The clicking escalated into a staccato rhythm, not random now but patterned like Morse code tapped out by 100 needle-thin fingers. Vega's earpiece spat static. Then, clear as a bell, Dawes in her own voice. Dawes didn't flinch. His rifle stayed trained on the tree line, but Shaw saw the tendon in his jaw jump when the thing wearing Vega's voice sighed his name again. Soft, intimate, the way she'd whispered it to him in the bunker's supply closet 3 weeks ago. The smaller Wendigo convulsed at their feet, its spine arching unnaturally as black bile seeped from its nostrils. Shaw's dart should have stopped its heart. Instead, its fingers twitched in the dirt, tracing symbols that looked uncomfortably like the facility's containment runes. Vega's boot came down hard on its wrist with a crack of splintering bone. The creature didn't scream. It laughed, a sound like ice cracking under thin soles. Kessler's body jerked in Shaw's arms. His mouth opened not to scream, but to sing, the notes warped and gurgling through the blood in his throat. "Oh, Danny boy," the lullaby their chopper pilot had been humming during insertion. Shaw's knife was at Kessler's jugular before the second verse. Vega caught his wrist. "It's not him anymore." Her voice was steady, but her pupils were blown wide. The UV flare's dying light caught the sweat on her upper lip. The knife trembled in Shaw's grip. Kessler's throat pulsed under the blade, his voice spiraling into a wet, off-key rendition of the pipes. "The pipes are calling." Dawes didn't look at them. His rifle stayed trained on the tree line, but his free hand flicked a signal, "Execute." Vega's fingers tightened around Shaw's wrist, not to stop him, to steady the cut. Kessler's song cut off mid-note. Silence, then the forest inhaled. Shaw's blade slid across Kessler's throat with a sound like wet leather parting. The forest held its breath. No final gurgle, no twitch, just the slow seep of blood into pine needles, black in the dying flare light. Vega exhaled through her nose, her grip still welded to Shaw's wrist. The knife's edge gleamed with a single fat drop of blood suspended at its tip. Dawes didn't flinch. His rifle stayed leveled at the tree line, but his left hand moved, subtle, quick, tapping the magazine release. The spent clip hit the dirt with a thud too loud for the quiet. Shaw knew what it meant, last mag, make it count. Above them the branches trembled under unseen weight. The clicking had stopped. The silence was worse. Vega's flare gun hissed as its last dregs of UV sputtered out. Shadows pooled around them like ink. Shaw's earpiece crackled, not static this time, but a perfect, crisp reproduction of Dawes' voice. "Fall back to grid delta." The voice in Shaw's earpiece was Dawes, down to the gravelly hitch he got after 3 days without sleep. Problem was, Dawes' lips hadn't moved. Vega's flare gun clattered to the ground, its casing splitting open like an eggshell. The UV glow died in a sizzle of sparks, plunging them into a darkness so complete Shaw felt it press against his eyeballs. His knife was still slick in his hand, Kessler's blood cooling between his fingers. Clicking. Not from the trees this time, from inside his earpiece. The earpiece's click echoed inside Shaw's skull, a sound like a cockroach's leg skittering across bone. Vega's breath hitched beside him, she'd heard it too. Dawes' voice purred again through the static, syrup-smooth, left flank clear. Shaw ripped the earpiece out just as Vega's rifle erupted, muzzle flash illuminating Dawes' face for half a second, just long enough to see the sergeant's mouth clamped shut, his eyes wide. The rounds tore into something fleshy beyond the light. A wet thump. Then laughter, high and girlish, rolling through the trees in H-Su's pitch-perfect cadence. Dawes moved first, grabbing Shaw's vest to yank him backward. Mind shaft. Now. His real voice was raw, stripped of the filter's false calm. Vega covered their retreat with controlled bursts, her shots punctuated by the snap of branches as things moved just beyond sight. The GPS on Shaw's wrist lit up, 200 yards northeast, the pulsing dot of the collapsed mine superimposed over the terrain like a bullseye. Something snatched at Shaw's ankle. He kicked blindly, his boot connecting with what felt like a bundle of wet sticks. A hiss, then a voice, Kessler's this time, whispered, "You promised you'd bring me home from the darkness at knee level." Shaw stomped down hard. The crunch of cartilage was drowned out by Vega's scream. Shaw's boots skidded on loose shale as Dawes hauled him backward. Vega's screams cut off abruptly, replaced by the snick of a blade, then a wet, meaty thud. The forest exhaled. "Move," Dawes barked, shoving Shaw toward a gash in the hillside where rusted mine supports sagged like broken ribs. Shaw stumbled, his shoulder clipping a support beam. Rotting wood gave way with a groan, revealing pitch-black tunnels beyond. The GPS blinked wildly in his wrist mount, 50 yards. The dot pulsed directly beneath them. Vega's silhouette staggered into view behind them, her rifle slung across her back, combat knife glistening black in the moonlight. Something twitched at her feet, a spindly, antlerless thing with too many elbows, its severed head still whispering "Dawes, Dawes, Dawes" through shattered teeth. Dawes didn't hesitate. He grabbed Vega's wrist and yanked her into the mine's gaping mouth just as the first of the antlered shapes lunged from the tree line. Its claws scraped the rocks behind them, close enough to shred the back of Shaw's vest. The mine swallowed them whole, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something older, copper, maybe, or the ghost of dynamite fumes. Vega's knife hand trembled. Shaw couldn't tell if it was adrenaline or the way the creature at her feet kept mouthing Dawes' name, its lips moving like a gutted fish gasping for air. Dawes put a bullet through its skull without breaking stride. The echo bounced down the tunnel, a rolling thunder that faded into the sound of dripping water. Shaw's headlamp flickered as they descended, the beam cutting through cobwebs that clung like gauze. The walls were scored with marks, not pickaxe strikes but grooves too precise, too deliberate, forming patterns that made Shaw's stomach knot. Vega traced one with a gloved finger. "These aren't claw marks." A click answered from the darkness ahead. Not the Wendigos this time, mechanical, rhythmic. The GPS on Shaw's wrist beeped once, then died. Dawes froze, his rifle trained on a bend in the tunnel where the shadows pooled unnaturally thick. Something glinted in the blackness. A tripwire. Shaw's boot hovered over the tripwire, his headlamp catching the gleam of monofilament stretched taut an inch above the tunnel floor. Dawes' hand clamped onto his shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Don't." The wire trembled not from their movement, but from something beyond the bend, stirring in the dark. Vega's knife came up, reflecting the dim red blink of a security panel half buried in the wall. Shaw hadn't noticed it before, camouflaged beneath layers of grime and those strange, precise carvings. The display read, "Sector 9, Containment Protocol Active." Dawes exhaled through his nose. "That's facility tech." His voice was low, but the tunnel carried it like a shout. Vega's blade nicked the panel's edge, prying it open to reveal a keypad crusted with old blood. The numbers 720 were worn smooth from repeated use. Shaw's gut twisted. Filter 7.2. Not a coincidence. The keypad beeped under Vega's gloved fingers, 7-2-0, and the tunnel groaned like a waking beast. Rusted gears ground somewhere beneath them, shaking loose a shower of grit that pattered against Shaw's helmet. The tripwire snapped with a ping, followed by a hiss of pressurized hydraulics. Dawes' rifle didn't waver. Facility doesn't bury keypads in active Wendigo zones. A slab of tunnel wall slid aside, revealing a fluorescent-lit hallway so sterile it burned Shaw's retinas after the mine's gloom. The air smelled of antiseptic and something sharper, like ozone after a lightning strike. Vega's knife hovered near the threshold. Then who the hell? A voice crackled from a speaker grill above the door. Wolfhound unit, proceed to decontamination. It wasn't Rayner. The vowels were too crisp, the cadence all wrong. Shaw's earpiece fizzed, dead since he'd ripped it out, but the voice echoed inside his skull anyway, syncing perfectly with the speaker. You're late. Dawes stepped through first, his boots leaving bloody prints on the white tile. Shaw counted 12 doors lining the hallway, each marked with a black number stenciled at eye level. None matched the symbols carved into the tunnel walls. Vega paused at door 3, her knife tip nudging it open a fraction. Empty. Her voice was flat. Just a cot and Christ, is that a collar? Dawes' boot kicked the collar across the floor. A thick band of dull metal lined with electrodes, the interior crusted with something dark and flaky. Shaw nudged it with his toe. The stench hit him first, old sweat, antiseptic, and beneath it, the sour tang of fear-soaked skin. Vega's knife tip flipped it over, revealing a serial number etched into the metal, Subj 379. The speaker hissed again. Decontamination mandatory. This time the voice stuttered, a half-second glitch where it dropped into a lower register, something guttural and wet. Shaw's skin prickled. He knew that glitch. Facility AI didn't stutter. Vega's fingers twitched toward her rifle. Dawes caught her wrist. Not here. His eyes flicked to the ceiling corners where black domes gleamed, too small for standard cameras, their lenses irised wide like pupils. The hallway ended at a steel door marked DECON. No handle, just a palm scanner glowing faintly blue. Shaw pressed his hand to it before Dawes could stop him. The light flickered red, then green. A mechanized voice announced, "Identity confirmed. Shaw, welcome back." The door hissed open, revealing a chrome chamber reeking of bleach and something under it, burnt hair maybe. Vega balked at the threshold, her rifle stock creaking under white-knuckled grip. The hell does welcome back mean? Shaw didn't answer. The decon shower nozzles stared down like insect eyes. He knew this place. Not the layout, not the smell, but the feel. The way his ribs tightened the same as they had in the Piedmont tunnels, like his body remembered what his mind didn't. Dawes shoved past him, shrugging off his blood-crusted vest. Strip, now. His tone left no room for debate, but his hands trembled as he unbuckled his belt. Vega's eyes locked onto the fresh scratches along his collarbone, 3 parallel lines, too precise for claws. The speaker above crackled. Contaminant detected, initiate purge. The nozzles hissed. Shaw barely had time to brace before icy fluid sluiced over him, stinging his nostrils with the chemical bite of industrial-grade disinfectant. Vega recoiled, her bare shoulders hitting the chrome wall as the spray turned pink with Kessler's blood swirling down the drain. Dawes stood motionless under the deluge, his gaze fixed on the ceiling vents where something darker than water dripped, thick, syrupy, with a sheen like motor oil. The shower cut off abruptly. A gust of scorching air blasted from overhead, raising blisters on Shaw's skin before he could shield his face. Vega cursed, rubbing her arms where the heat had turned her tattoos into a blur of melted ink. The speaker crackled again, its voice warping mid-sentence. Purge complete. Proceed to, the words dissolved into static, then a wet, clicking sigh. The inner door slid open. Beyond it stretched another hallway, this one lined with observation windows fogged from the inside. Shaw pressed a palm to the glass, leaving a smudge. The room beyond was empty save for a steel table bolted to the floor, its surface scored with deep grooves, not tool marks but something frenzied, desperate. A single restraint dangled from the table's edge, its leather strap gnawed through. Dawes nudged the next door open with his boot. The room beyond was a control booth, its monitors flickering with feeds of empty cells. One screen showed Cell 9, its glass smeared with handprints too large to be human. The chair in front of the console was overturned, a half-empty coffee cup beside it, the liquid inside long since congealed into a black crust. The coffee cup rattled as Dawes' boot knocked it over, the black sludge inside spreading like ink across the console. Vega's knife tip tapped the keyboard dead. No power, except for the flickering monitors showing empty cells. Shaw's gaze lingered on Cell 9's feed. The handprints were fresh. A low hum vibrated through the floor. Not machinery, vocalization. The same wet clicking from the forest, but slower, syncopated. Vega's blade hovered near a red button labeled Quarantine Override. Dawes caught her wrist. Don't. That's not Facility Protocol. His thumb brushed the engraving beneath the button, property of Site-37, the letters scratched out and replaced with Sector 9 in jagged script. Shaw's headlamp flickered over the far wall, illuminating a map taped beside a shattered monitor. The layout didn't match the mine above. Too symmetrical, too deliberate. A hexagon subdivided into 9 sectors, each labeled with runes that made Shaw's teeth ache. Sector 9 glowed red, pulsing in time with the hum beneath their feet. The speaker above them crackled. Subject retrieval required. This time the voice was Vega's. The voice from the speaker, Vega's voice, hung in the air like a knife balanced on its point. Shaw's fingers twitched toward his sidearm before he remembered it was sitting in a decon bin 3 rooms back, sterilized and useless. Vega herself stood frozen, her knife still hovering near the quarantine button, her breath shallow. Dawes' grip on her wrist tightened. "Don't react," he murmured, so low Shaw almost didn't catch it. The hum beneath them crescendoed into a chorus of clicks, rhythmic and deliberate. Shaw's eyes darted to the monitors. Cell 9's feed was static now, but the others, cells 1 through 8, flickered to life one by one. Empty, all empty, except... Cell 7's camera panned left, catching a smear of movement against the far wall. Not a figure, a shadow elongated and wrong, its edges too sharp for the dim light. It pressed against the glass for a heartbeat, then peeled away like wet paper. The speaker hissed. "Specimen requires recalibration." This time it was Dawes' voice, stripped of its usual grit, every consonant too precise. Dawes didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the console, his bare feet leaving damp prints on the tile. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating over a key labeled Manual Override. Vega's knife shifted toward him, not a threat, a warning. Shaw caught her eye and shook his head once. Dawes knew what he was doing, probably. Dawes' finger descended on the override key. The console beeped, once, twice. Then the hum beneath them stuttered into silence. The monitors flickered, their feeds dissolving into rolling static before reforming into a single, unified image, a live feed of Cell 9. The glass was smeared with fresh streaks of black ichor. Behind it, something moved. Not the antlered silhouette they'd hunted in the woods. This was bulkier, its outline shifting unnaturally like a reflection in disturbed water. The speaker above them crackled, cycling through voices, Rainer S., then H. Sue's, then Kessler's, before settling into a neutral synthetic tone. Specimen containment at 72%. Reinitiate. Vega's knife clattered against the console. Shaw caught it before it hit the floor, his fingers closing around the hilt just as the floor trembled. Not a quake, something pulsing, rhythmic like a heartbeat transmitted through concrete. The monitor feed twisted, the image warping as though the camera itself was recoiling. For half a second, Shaw saw it. A single, lidless eye pressed against Cell 9's glass, its pupil a vertical slit that dilated hungrily at the sight of them. Dawes exhaled through his teeth. "That's not a Wendigo." The monitor flickered again, just long enough for Shaw to register the eye's sclera wasn't white, but the same oily black as the drips in decon. Then static swallowed the feed. The speaker above them emitted a wet, clicking sigh. "Specimen requires nourishment." Dawes' fingers flew over the console, pulling up a submenu labeled Feding Protocol. The options were handwritten in shaky script: live donor / preserved / recalibrate. Vega's breath hitched. That's not facility terminology. Shaw's grip tightened on her knife. The hum beneath them had returned, deeper now, vibrating up through his soles like the purr of some enormous engine. The floor vents exhaled a draft of air that reeked of copper and spoiled meat. Dawes' fingers hovered over recalibrate. The console beeped a warning: authorization required. A new voice crackled from the speaker, Project Lead Rainer S, but stretched thin like a recording played at half speed. Wolfhound Unit, report to observation. The speaker clicked off mid-sentence, leaving Rainer's last syllable hanging like a noose. Vega's fingers dug into Shaw's bicep hard enough to leave crescent moons in his skin. Dawes didn't move, just kept staring at the console where the word recalibrate pulsed in warning red. The hum beneath them deepened, vibrating up through Shaw's molars in a way that made his fillings ache. Vega mouthed observation at Shaw, jerking her chin toward a door marked observation deck in peeling letters. The handle was crusted with something that flaked away when Shaw brushed it with his knuckles. Behind them, the console beeped again, insistent now, as the monitor feed dissolved into pixelated snow. For half a second, Shaw caught a glimpse of Cell 9's interior reflected in the static. The glass smeared with palm prints too large, too wrong, their fingers tapering into points that scraped the surface with audible scritches. Dawes exhaled through his nose and punched live donor. The console screamed. Alarms blared, not the facility's standard klaxons, but a shrill, ululating wail that set Shaw's teeth on edge. The overhead lights stuttered into strobes, casting jagged shadows that slithered up the walls like living things. Vega's knife flashed as she lunged for the observation door, her shoulder slamming into it just as the first thud rattled the vents above them. Something heavy was moving through the ductwork, its weight making the metal groan. The sterilization system's control panel sparked under Vega's knife as she pried it open, exposing a nest of wires humming with residual charge. Shaw's headlamp caught the UV emitters lining the decon chamber's ceiling, industrial grade, the kind that could flay a man's skin in 30 seconds flat. Too weak, she muttered, tracing the circuitry with her blade. Then she saw it, the secondary conduit labeled crystal array. The facility never updated their blueprints. Dawes braced against the observation door as something massive hit the other side, the steel denting inward with a shriek of stressed metal. Shaw tossed Vega a canister of silver filament salvaged from their shredded nets. She caught it midair, her fingers already stripping insulation from the UV array's main feed. Gonna need a diversion. Her voice was calm, but Shaw saw the tremor in her hands as she spliced the filament into the conduit. The vents above them vomited a stream of black ichor. Dawes didn't flinch. Got 20 seconds after I hit the switch. He nodded to a rusted lever near the floor manual override, the kind that hadn't been used since the Cold War. The placard above it was scratched raw, but Shaw could still make out the faded letters. Sector 9 Containment Initiate. Vega's knife hovered over the final connection. The chamber lights flickered, then stabilized into an eerie violet glow. Shadows crawled up the walls like burned film peeling from a projector. Shaw's earpiece, useless since the forest, suddenly crackled to life with a voice that wasn't Rainer's, wasn't human. Specimen recognizes donor. Vega's blade completed the circuit with a shower of sparks, the UV array flaring to life with a sound like 1,000 wasps igniting. The chamber flooded with violet light so intense it etched their shadows into the walls. Shaw's vision whited out for a heartbeat, just long enough to miss the thing unspooling from the ceiling vent, its limbs too many and too jointed, dripping black where the light licked its flesh. Dawes didn't hesitate. He stomped on the rusted lever. Gears groaned deep within the walls, shearing through decades of grime. The decon chamber's inner door shrieked shut a millisecond before the Wendigo hit it, the impact denting steel. Its antlers scraped the glass with a nails-on chalkboard screech as it twisted to face them, its pupil-less eyes reflecting the UV glow like pooled oil. "Move!" Vega yanked Shaw backward as the Wendigo's fingers, too long, too wrong, slipped through the door's closing gap. The UV array's hum climbed to a teeth-rattling frequency. The creature's flesh blackened where the light touched it, curling away in ribbons of smoke that stank of burnt hair and spoiled meat. It didn't scream. It chittered, the sound skittering through Shaw's skull like a cockroach in his ear canal. Dawes' boot crunched down on the creature's fingers. Bones snapped. The Wendigo recoiled, its arm whipping back into the chamber just as the outer door sealed with a hiss of pressurized hydraulics. The console above them flickered, containment initiated, purge cycle commencing. The UV array's hum peaked into a tinnitus-inducing whine, the light so intense it bleached the color from Vega's tattoos as she scrambled back. The Wendigo's silhouette convulsed behind the chamber's fogged glass, its elongated limbs flailing like a moth caught in a lantern. Black fluid spattered the interior, sizzling where the light touched it. Dawes didn't celebrate. He was already at the observation panel, fingers flying over cracked buttons. The monitors flickered. Cell 9's feed showed the containment door grinding open, its hydraulics screaming. Shaw's stomach dropped. "It's hurting us." Vega's knife scraped the floor as she dragged herself upright. "Then we don't go where it wants." She pointed to the service conduit above the decon chamber, a narrow maintenance shaft labeled Crystal Array Access. The hatch hung open, its hinges smeared with something that glistened under the UV glow. The Wendigo's thrashing intensified. Hairline fractures spiderwebbed across the chamber's glass. Dawes grabbed Vega's shoulder, shouting over the klaxons. "That shaft leads straight to—" The UV array's whine climbed to a frequency that made Shaw's teeth ache. Vega's fingers danced across the jury-rigged wiring, her knife tip bridging gaps in the circuit where silver filaments smoked and sputtered. The Wendigo's silhouette spasmed behind the chamber glass, its antlers scoring deep furrows in the steel as it twisted away from the light. Not fleeing, Shaw realized with dawning horror, but turning, presenting its back to the scorching beams. Dawes saw it too. "It's adapting," he snarled, slamming his palm against the manual override panel. Rust flaked off under his fingers, revealing a single button glowing corpse bale beneath the grime. Flush. Vega didn't look up from her work. Need 30 more seconds. Sweat dripped from her nose onto the exposed wiring, sizzling where it hit the overloaded conduits. The sterilization chamber's glass cracked with a sound like ice splitting underfoot. Black ichor seeped through the fractures, elongating into tendrils that quested blindly toward the console. Shaw moved without thinking. His boot connected with the emergency shower lever, releasing a deluge of icy water that sluiced across the chamber's exterior. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound that started in its gullet and ended in Shaw's earpiece as a burst of static that tasted like blood. The tendrils recoiled, but the glass kept splintering, the cracks forming a pattern too symmetrical to be accidental, 9 intersecting lines, pulsing like veins. The UV array screamed like a dying star, its violet light carving Vega's shadow into the wall as she wrenched the last wire into place. Sparks spat from the jury-rigged conduit, tracing jagged lines across her knuckles. Shaw watched her lips move, counting down from 30, but the sound was swallowed by the Wendigo's claws scraping against the chamber's buckling glass. Dawes' fingers hovered over the flush button, his palms slick with rust and sweat. The manual override panel vibrated under his touch, its antique mechanisms groaning like a hanged man's rope. 20 seconds. The cracks in the glass spider-webbed outward, each fracture oozing black filaments that tasted the air like tongues. Vega's knife slipped. A spark arced across the silver filament, searing her thumb. She didn't flinch. 15. The UV emitters flared brighter, their light refracting through the chamber's mist in prismatic shards. The Wendigo's silhouette twisted, no longer flailing but rearranging, its vertebrae popping audibly as it contorted to present less surface area to the scorching beams. 10. 9. Vega's knife flashed as she severed the last safety coupling, sending the UV array into overdrive. The emitters screamed, their violet light strobing like a dying star. Tendrils of smoke curled from the wiring as the filament glowed white-hot, the silver searing through insulation and into her palm. She didn't let go. 8. The Wendigo's silhouette froze mid-contortion, then unfolded, its limbs snapping into new configurations with wet, popping sounds. Shaw's earpiece fizzed with static, amplifying the creature's clicks into a language that hooked behind his eyeballs and pulled. Dawes' fingers spasmed against the flush button. 7. The UV emitters pulsed like a dying heartbeat, their violet glare etching the Wendigo's shadow onto the chamber walls in jagged, jerking strokes. Vega's knife hand trembled, not from pain, but from the current arcing through the jury-rigged circuit, turning her veins into neon-blue tributaries beneath her skin. The creature's clicks synchronized with the strobing light, a grotesque Morse code that made Shaw's molars vibrate. 6. Dawes' thumb whitened against the flush button. Rust flaked off beneath his nail. The chamber glass groaned, fractures spreading like frost across a pond. Black tendrils probed the cracks, their tips splitting into finer filaments that tasted the air with microscopic mouths. Vega's teeth clenched so hard Shaw heard enamel crack. 5. Vega's knife slipped again, this time embedding itself in the console as her fingers spasmed around the smoking silver filament. The UV array's whine hit a frequency that liquefied the air in Shaw's lungs. The Wendigo's silhouette spasmed behind the chamber's fractured glass, not recoiling now, but pressing forward, its antlers carving deeper furrows as it leveraged itself against the buckling steel. 4. Dawes punched the flush button. The flush button depressed with a crunch like a ribcage collapsing. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the floor shook with the force of 1,000 pistons firing at once, throwing Shaw onto his knees. The UV array's whine climbed into ultrasonic registers, peeling paint from the walls in curling strips. Vega's makeshift wiring exploded in a shower of molten silver and ozone, the backlash sending her skidding across the tile as the chamber's glass shattered. Not outward, inward. The Wendigo lunged. Just as the overhead nozzles unleashed a torrent of liquid nitrogen, so cold it flash-froze the creature's outstretched claws midair. Frost spiderwebbed across its antlers with audible cracks, its pupils dilating in slow, horrified understanding as the UV beams refracted through the frozen mist, magnifying their intensity tenfold. "Go," Dawes hauled Vega upright, shoving her toward the maintenance shaft. Shaw scrambled after them, his boots slipping on ice-slick tiles. Behind them, the chamber's reinforced door screamed shut, hydraulics shearing through the Wendigo's frozen fingers like a guillotine. Black ichor splattered the observation window, sizzling where it touched the supercooled glass. The maintenance shaft exhaled a breath of stale, metallic air as Vega wrenched herself up into its cramped darkness, her shoulders scraping against conduit pipes crusted with decades of grime. Below, the sterilization chamber's reinforced door groaned under the Wendigo's thrashing, the sound muffled but insistent, a predator denied. Shaw's headlamp flickered over the access panel above them, its label half scoured away, Crystal Array Maintenance. Vega's fingers traced the edges. "This runs parallel to Sector 9's holding cells," she whispered, her voice frayed at the edges. "If we follow it." Dawes' hand clamped over her mouth as the shaft trembled. A new sound seeped through the pipes, not the Wendigo's struggle but something liquid, a slithering vibration that made the metal sweat beads of condensation. Shaw's earpiece, dead since the forest, suddenly regurgitated a burst of static that resolved into a wet, rhythmic clicking. The same pattern as before, but slower, deliberate, counting. The UV array's dying hum shuddered through the shaft walls, its violet light bleeding through cracks in the paneling like bioluminescent veins. Vega pried open the access hatch with her knife, revealing a crawlspace choked with fiber optic cables and the glassy spines of deactivated emitter rods. crystal array backups, their quartz filaments dulled by age. Shaw's boot dislodged a dust-caked manual wedged beneath a coolant pipe. Site 37 Emergency Protocols. The pages fell open to a diagram of the UV system's fail-safes, annotated in hurried script. Array can be manually overloaded via primary junction. Sacrifice range for intensity. Vega's knife was already at work, severing coolant lines to reroute power. The pipes exhaled vapor that crystallized on her lashes as she spliced the array's primary feed into a single, jury-rigged emitter rod. "It's a flare now," she breathed, the rod's quartz core flickering to life in her palm. One burst, 5 seconds max before it melts down. Vega's makeshift emitter rod pulsed in her grip, its quartz core throbbing like a second heartbeat. The UV light bled through her fingers, turning her veins into luminous highways beneath her skin. Shaw watched her adjust the final connection, a frayed silver filament spliced into the array's overloaded conduit, and felt his stomach tighten. 5 seconds. That's all they'd have before the rod detonated in her hand. Dawes didn't wait for confirmation. He wrenched open the maintenance hatch below them, revealing a vertiginous drop into the decon chamber's service crawlspace. The Wendigo's thrashing had stopped. Silence pooled in the shaft like spilled ink. "Lure it back," Dawes mouthed, pointing to the chamber's observation window. The glass was webbed with fractures, each crack weeping black ichor that dripped onto the control console below. Vega nodded once and pressed the emitter rod against the access panel. The metal sizzled. Shaw moved first, dropping into the crawlspace with a thud that echoed too loud in the cramped darkness. The Wendigo would hear. It would come. His palms slid across coolant pipes slick with condensation, the moisture freezing against his skin. Behind him, Vega's boots hit the grating, her breath sharp in the dead air. The emitter rod's glow painted the walls in violet stripes, revealing handprints too large, too wrong, smudged along the pipes. Vega's thumb hovered over the emitter rod's activation switch, a makeshift trigger cobbled from a syringe plunger and stripped wire. The quartz core pulsed hotter, its violet light etching fractures into the glass housing. 3 seconds until meltdown. 2. She exhaled through her nose and jammed the rod into the crawlspace's main coolant line. The reaction was instantaneous. Superheated steam erupted from the ruptured pipe, filling the narrow passage with a scalding fog that reeked of burnt copper. The Wendigo clicked from somewhere in the decon chamber below, not the hunting staccato from the woods, but a slower, curious rhythm that made Shaw's fillings vibrate. Vega didn't flinch. She twisted the emitter rod's filament tighter, watching the quartz glow white-hot as it siphoned power directly from the facility's crippled grid. Above them, Dawes braced against a shuddering pipe, his boots slipping on ice-crusted metal. The crawlspace hatch groaned under his weight, its rusted hinges bleeding orange onto the grating. He didn't need to signal. They all heard it, the wet shuck of the Wendigo's claws unsheathing from the chamber walls, the creak of its antlers as it turned toward the steam venting from the crawlspace. Vega's knife flashed in the UV glow as she severed the last safety coupling. The emitter rod screamed, its light strobing erratically. Shadows leapt and twisted like hanged men dancing on the pipes. Shaw pressed his back against the crawlspace wall as the Wendigo's silhouette loomed beyond the access panel's fogged glass, closer now, drawn by the heat, the light, the promise of prey cornered in tight darkness. Vega's thumb hovered over the emitter rod's activation switch, a makeshift trigger cobbled from a syringe plunger and stripped wire. The quartz core pulsed hotter, its violet light etching fractures into the glass housing. 3 seconds until meltdown. 2. She exhaled through her nose and jammed the rod into the crawlspace's main coolant line. The reaction was instantaneous. Superheated steam erupted from the ruptured pipe, filling the narrow passage with a scalding fog that reeked of burnt copper. The Wendigo clicked from somewhere in the decon chamber below, not the hunting staccato from the woods, but a slower, curious rhythm that made Shaw's fillings vibrate. Vega didn't flinch. She twisted the emitter rod's filament tighter, watching the quartz glow white-hot as it siphoned power directly from the facility's crippled grid. Above them, Dawes braced against a shuddering pipe, his boots slipping on ice-crusted metal. The crawlspace hatch groaned under his weight, its rusted hinges bleeding orange onto the grating. He didn't need to signal. They all heard it, the wet shuck of the Wendigo's claws unsheathing from the chamber walls, the creak of its antlers as it turned toward the steam venting from the crawlspace. Vega's knife flashed in the UV glow as she severed the last safety coupling. The emitter rod screamed, its light strobing erratically. Shadows leapt and twisted like hanged men dancing on the pipes. Shaw pressed his back against the crawlspace wall as the Wendigo's silhouette loomed beyond the access panel's fogged glass, closer now, drawn by the heat, the light, the promise of prey cornered in tight darkness. The emitter rod's quartz core cracked like thin ice under Vega's grip, its violet light bleeding through her fingers in jagged pulses. 3 seconds left. She could feel the heat blistering her palm through the makeshift insulation of shredded wiring, smell the silver filament cooking her skin. The Wendigo's shadow stretched across the crawlspace wall, elongated, antlered, its edges vibrating with each strobing flash from the overloaded UV array. Shaw's breath hitched as the creature's claws scraped the access panel's exterior. Too close. Vega didn't flinch. She jammed the emitter rod deeper into the ruptured coolant line, twisting until the quartz core screamed in protest. Steam geysered upward, filling the crawlspace with a scalding fog that reeked of melted plastic and something darker, fouler, the stench of the Wendigo's breath as it pressed its maw to the fogged glass. Dawes moved like a piston. His boot connected with the access panel's emergency release, shearing through rusted bolts. The hatch exploded outward, straight into the Wendigo's face. Black ichor sprayed the pipes as its nose shattered, the impact buying Vega the half-second she needed to wrench the emitter rod free and hurl it into the decon chamber's yawning maw. The Wendigo twisted, its spine bending at impossible angles to avoid the scorching light, but Vega had aimed for the floor. The quartz core detonated on impact, unleashing a concussive wave of UV radiation that turned the chamber into a violet sun. The creature recoiled, its flesh blackening where the light licked its limbs, its chittering scream syncing with the array's death throes. The emitter rod's detonation lit the crawlspace in jagged ultraviolet, bleaching the walls bone-white for one crystalline second. Vega's vision swam with afterimages, the Wendigo's silhouette frozen mid-recoil, its antlers casting spiderweb shadows across the chamber ceiling as the UV pulse seared its flesh black. Then darkness slammed back down, thicker now, clotting the air with the stench of scorched hair and something sweetly rotten. Dawes didn't wait for his eyes to adjust. He was already moving, his boots kicking aside twisted piping to reach the manual override panel, an antique steel console crusted with decades of grime. His fingers found the rusted lever by touch alone. "Seals holding," he rasped, throwing his weight against the mechanism. Gears groaned deep within the walls. The decon chamber's inner door shrieked inward another inch, hydraulics weeping black fluid. Vega's hands shook as she peeled melted wiring from her palm. The Wendigo wasn't screaming. It was laughing, a wet, clicking gurgle that syncopated with the chamber's failing UV array. Shaw's headlamp caught the creature's reflection in the observation glass. Its torso was fused to the back wall where the blast had thrown it, ribs exposed through crisped flesh, but its fingers still twitched toward them, each knuckle popping as the bones realigned. Overrides jammed. Dawes kicked the console. A shower of rust pattered onto the floor. Vega shoved past him, her knife flashing as she pried open the access panel beneath the lever. The inner workings were a nest of corroded relays and brittle insulation, but she didn't hesitate, just rammed her blade between two contacts and twisted. Sparks geysered upward, illuminating the emergency schematic etched inside the panel, crystal array purge sequence. Vega's knife carved through brittle insulation, exposing the UV array's primary junction box, a nest of oxidized wiring and cracked quartz conduits. The schematic had been right. Site 37's Original designers had built redundancies into every system, including manual purge triggers for when the automation failed. Her fingers worked on muscle memory, splicing silver filament from their shredded nets into the array's fried circuitry. The Wendigo's laughter vibrated through the pipes, syncing with the arrhythmic flicker of emergency lights overhead. "Give me a diversion," she hissed, jerking her chin toward the observation window where the creature's silhouette pulsed against the glass. Its fingers had begun to regrow, blackened bone knitting itself back together with threads of glistening ichor. Shaw didn't hesitate. He slammed his boot into a sagging coolant pipe, the impact ringing through the crawlspace like a gong. The Wendigo's head snapped toward the sound, its antlers scraping furrows in the ceiling as it twisted to pinpoint the noise's origin. Vega used the distraction to jam her knife into the junction box, bridging two contacts that hadn't touched since the Reagan administration. Sparks erupted in a strobing cascade, illuminating Dawes' face as he hauled on the rusted purge lever with both hands. The chamber's inner door groaned inward another inch, shearing off the Wendigo's regenerating fingertips. Ichor sprayed across the control console, sizzling where it touched exposed wiring. The creature didn't scream, it sang, a warped mimicry of Vega's voice cycling through disjointed phrases from their mission briefing. "Containment at 72%, specimen requires." Shaw's earpiece crackled, a burst of static that resolved into a voice too smooth, too wrong, repeating "specimen secured" in Project Lead Rayner's cadence but none of his warmth. He tore it out just as sunlight hit his retinas like a shiv to the optic nerve. The trio stumbled onto the derelict ski resort's loading dock, snowblind and gasping, their boots crunching through decades of accumulated frost. Then the ground moved. A seismic groan rolled through the mountain beneath them, vibrating up through Shaw's fillings. The resort's skeletal remains shuddered, support beams splintering, sheet metal peeling away like old scabs, as something enormous collapsed deep within Site 37's guts. Vega caught herself against a rusted snowcat, her fingers sinking into corroded metal as the parking lot fractured in jagged lines. Dawes didn't flinch. He was staring at the resort's gaping elevator shaft, now vomiting a geyser of black smoke into the alpine air. The voice in Shaw's discarded earpiece kept chanting, "Specimen secured, specimen secured." Vega spat blood onto the snow. "That's not Rayner." Her breath plumed in the sudden cold, the words crystallizing midair. The mountain exhaled with her. A secondary collapse detonated somewhere below, heaving the asphalt upward in a buckling wave that sent Shaw to his knees. His palms hit the ground just in time to feel it, a rhythmic thudding, too deliberate to be aftershocks. Something was climbing the ruined elevator shaft. Dawes' boot connected with the snowcat's fuel tank. Rust flaked away under his heel, revealing a faded flammable stencil. "Meltdown protocol," he growled, jerking his chin toward the resort's shattered windows. Inside, emergency lights pulsed crimson through the dust-choked halls. The voice in Shaw's earpiece stuttered, then reset. "Specimen, specimen, specimen." Vega was already moving, her knife flashing as she pried open the snowcat's corroded access panel. The fuel gauge needle trembled deep in the red. Shaw watched her fingers dance across frayed wiring, then freeze. A new sound cut through the mountain's death throes, a wet, metallic screech from the elevator shaft, like antlers scraping steel. Dawes didn't look. He tore a strip from his sleeve, knotting it around the fuel line Vega had exposed. 5 minutes max before containment fails. His lighter sparked once, twice, then caught, the flame reflecting in his pupils like distant gunfire. "Move." The earpiece's chant dissolved into static as Shaw sprinted after them across the buckling asphalt. Behind them, the resort's skeleton groaned, then folded, its roof collapsing inward with a sound like a ribcage imploding. A shockwave of dust and debris rolled across the parking lot, swallowing the snowcat whole before the fuel tank could detonate. Vega's boots hit the tree line just as the first hand breached the elevator shaft, elongated fingers sheathed in blackened skin, each knuckle popping as it gripped the twisted metal frame. The voice in Shaw's earpiece sighed, "Specimen approaching." Then the ground lurched, throwing him face first into the snow as the mountain itself seemed to rear up beneath them. Dawes hauled him upright by his vest straps. "Not the mountain." His breath came in ragged plumes. "It's hurting us." Vega's knife was out again, its edge catching the last of the dying UV light as she backed toward a service road switchbacking down the slope. The trees here were wrong, too still, their branches frozen midsway despite the tremors shaking the ground. Shaw's earpiece fizzed. The voice wasn't mimicking Raynor anymore. It was Sue's, her last words before the Wendigo took her, now looping in a choked whisper. "It mimics, mimics, mimics." The elevator shaft vomited a plume of black ichor skyward. Something unfolded from the wreckage, not the antlered horror they'd trapped below, but something leaner, its limbs jointed in too many places, its spine twisting like a flipped film reel as it scuttled up the collapsed roof tiles. Vega's knife hand twitched. "That's not the same one." Dawes didn't answer. He was staring at the snow between them where their footprints had already begun to fill in, the powder shifting like liquid to erase their path. The voice in Shaw's earpiece giggled, a sound no human throat could make. "Specimen acquired." Vega's flare gun clicked empty. She threw it at the creature anyway. It caught the weapon midair with a snap of elongated fingers, then crushed the steel barrel in its palm. The sound sent Shaw's teeth vibrating. The thing cocked its head, too far, the motion exposing vertebrae that shouldn't exist, and opened its mouth. Sue's voice spilled out. "Run." They ran. The slope became a nightmare of shifting angles. Trees leaned away from them, branches snagging at their vests with bark that split open to reveal wet, glistening tendons beneath. Shaw's boots hit ice and kept going, sliding uncontrollably toward a ravine that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. Dawes caught him by the strap, hauling him sideways as the ground yawned open where he'd been standing. The voice in his earpiece sighed, "Specimen approaching." Vega cut left, her knife flashing as she severed a low-hanging branch that lashed at her face. The wound bled black. The forest shrieked, not in pain but in recognition, the sound syncing with the thing scrabbling up the slope behind them. Shaw risked a glance back. The creature was moving wrong, not running but unspooling, its limbs telescoping to grip trees and fling itself forward in grotesque parodies of motion. Its jaw unhinged, and the forest scream poured from its throat in perfect mimicry. Dawes fired blindly behind them. The rounds hit nothing. The trees twitched aside to let them pass. Vega's headlamp flickered over a service shed ahead, rusted shut, its padlock crusted with decades of frost. Dawes didn't slow. His boot connected with the door, shearing through frozen hinges. The interior stank of gasoline and old blood. A snowmobile lay on its side, half dismantled, its fuel line severed. Vega was already moving, her knife under the snowmobile's seat. The creature's shadow darkened the doorway, its elongated fingers curling around the frame with a sound like ice cracking. Shaw's earpiece whispered, "Specimen." Dawes shot it. The creature twitched, not recoiling but reshaping, its torso spiraling to present less surface area to the bullet. Vega's knife found the snowmobile's emergency fuel reserve, a pint of stale gasoline in a rusted canister. She hurled it at the doorway just as Dawes' lighter arced through the air. The explosion lit the shed violet for one crystalline second. The creature's silhouette spasmed against the flames, its limbs elongating to snuff the fire with its own blackened flesh. Shaw glimpsed its face, not antlered but smooth, its features cycling through theirs with cadaverous precision. Vega's lips, Dawes' brow, Shaw's own terrified eyes blinking back at him. Then they were moving again, sprinting past the burning shed as the creature unfolded from the flames behind them, its skin sloughing off in charred strips to reveal glistening muscle beneath. The slope steepened suddenly, their boots skidding on ice that hadn't been there seconds ago. Vega's knife scraped against stone as she caught herself, just as the ground lurched, heaving upward in a buckling wave that sent Dawes sprawling. Shaw's earpiece fizzed. Specimen, the voice dissolved into static, then reformed as Sue's gasp. It's hurting us toward the... Daw's rifle cut her off. The creature twisted midair to avoid the burst, its spine bending like a flipped film reel. Vega's headlamp caught the ravine below, a jagged maw of black ice and splintered pines that hadn't existed on any recon map. The trees here were wrong, their trunks ribbed with pulsing veins, their branches twitching like antennae. The creature landed wrong, deliberately, its knees bending backward with wet pops as it crouched between them and the ravine. Its mouth unhinged. Daw's voice spilled out, "Throw me the flare." Shaw froze. The cadence was perfect, the same gravelly timbre, the same slight hesitation before the word flare. Vega's knife hand trembled. The creature smiled with Daw's lips. "Now." Shaw's earpiece exploded with static, then Raynor's voice, warped beyond recognition. "You left me in the dark." The ground convulsed again, this time with purpose, buckling upward in a wave that sent them skidding toward the ravine's edge. The creature didn't move. It watched, its borrowed face slack with anticipation as Shaw clawed at the ice, until Vega's knife flashed past his ear, embedding itself in the thing's throat. Black ichor geysered. The creature didn't flinch. It laughed, a sound like ice cracking over a frozen lake, and plucked the blade free with elongated fingers. The wound sealed instantly. Behind them, the ravine breathed, exhaling a gust of air so cold it flash-froze the sweat on Shaw's neck. "Specimen secured," whispered the earpiece, right before the ice beneath them screamed. The sound wasn't metaphorical. The permafrost split open in jagged fissures, each crack emitting a high-pitched wail that harmonized with the creature's clicking laughter. Shaw glimpsed movement in the fractures, not water but fingers, too many joints, pressing up against the ice from below. Vega was already moving, yanking him sideways as the ground where he'd knelt erupted in a spray of frozen shards. Something long and segmented whipped out of the hole, not a root, but a tongue, barbed and glistening, that lashed at the space his throat had occupied seconds earlier. Dawes fired 3 rounds into the fissure. The bullets ricocheted off something metallic deep below with a sound like a gong struck underwater. The creature tilted its head too far, the motion exposing vertebrae that flexed like a snake's, and opened its mouth. Sue's voice spilled out. "You're in Sector 9 now." Vega's boot connected with the creature's knee, the real one, not the backwards joint with a crunch that should have shattered bone. It didn't flinch. Its fingers wrapped around her ankle, the tips splitting open to reveal concentric rings of needle teeth that began rotating. Shaw's knife flashed down, severing the thing's wrist at the joint. Black fluid sprayed across the snow, each droplet writhing before crystallizing midair. The earpiece fizzed, "Specimen approaching." This time it used Raynor's voice, but the words came out wrong backwards, like a tape played in reverse. The fissures pulsed in time with the distortion, their edges flexing like gills. Dawes grabbed Vega's arm as she staggered, her severed bootlaces smoking where the creature's blood had touched them. "It's not just mimicking," he growled, dragging her toward a stand of pines whose branches twitched in sympathy with the thing's antlers. "It's learning our..." The ground breathed. A seismic exhale rolled through the mountain beneath them, shuddering up through Shaw's fillings as the permafrost split in jagged lines. The fractures didn't spread randomly. They converged, etching a perfect hexagon around the trio with geometric precision. Vega's knife hand shook as she realized. They weren't standing on snow. They were standing on glass, a massive observation window frosted over by centuries of ice, now cracking under their boots. The earpiece screamed, a sound too layered to be human, as if 100 voices had been recorded over each other and set ablaze. "Specimen, SECURED specimen secured SBACIM." Shaw tore it off just as the window beneath them shattered. They fell through freezing dark. The drop lasted both seconds and lifetimes. Shaw's stomach inverted as wind ripped at his clothes, the taste of copper flooding his mouth. Violet light strobed somewhere below, not the UV array, but something older, its glow filtered through rib-like structures of blackened metal. His shoulder connected with angled plating, the impact spinning him into a tangle of fiber-optic cables that whipped past like luminous seaweed. Vega hit first. Her body crumpled against a sloping bulkhead with a wet crack that sent Dawes roaring her name, but she was already moving, her knife flashing as she severed cables that lashed at her limbs. Shaw glimpsed her mouth moving, shaping words drowned by the screech of rending metal. Not glass, it's a... Then the remains of the observation window imploded above them, raining frosted shards that refracted the violet light into strobes. Dawes caught Shaw by the vest, hauling him sideways as something massive impacted where he'd lain. The creature's landing shattered the bulkhead beneath it, not the antlered horror from above, but something slick and segmented, its carapace glistening under the arrhythmic light. Its face was a smooth oval bisected by a vertical slit that dilated wetly as it tracked their movements. Shaw's discarded earpiece skittered past its claws, still screeching "SECURED" in a voice that was now unmistakably Raynor's. Vega's knife found the thing's flank and stuck fast. The creature didn't react. Its hide pulsed where the blade touched, swallowing the steel like quicksand. Dawes fired 3 rounds into its slit face. The bullets vanished without a sound. Then the real shaking began. The tremor hit like a god's fist. The violet light stuttered as conduits overhead ruptured, spraying coolant in arcing geysers that flash-froze against the creature's carapace. Shaw's vision doubled not from concussion, but because the walls themselves seemed to flex, the rib-like struts contracting like lungs around them. Vega's lips moved, her words lost in the groan of straining metal, but Shaw read them clear as sunrise. It's breathing. The earpiece's screech cut off abruptly as the creature's talon crushed it. In the sudden silence, Shaw heard it, the wet, rhythmic shuck of the Wendigo's claws unsheathing from the ceiling above them. Its antlers scraped the conduit-lined roof with a sound like 100 knives being sharpened at once. The segmented creature below cocked its head, too far, the motion exposing a spiral of needle teeth within its slit, and clicked in perfect mimicry of the Wendigo's hunting staccato. Dawes didn't hesitate. He grabbed Vega's wrist and wrenched her toward a fissure in the buckling bulkhead, not a crack, but an iris, its edges lined with pulsating filaments that retracted at their approach. Shaw glimpsed daylight through the opening, real daylight. He lunged after them just as the Wendigo dropped, its emaciated frame passing through the segmented creature like a shadow through smoke. Their forms merged for one nauseating second, antlers protruding from the slick carapace, elongated limbs fused with chitinous segments, before resolving into something new, something with too many joints and not enough skin. Shaw's boot caught on a loop of fiber-optic cabling. The thing behind him sang, a warped medley of H-Sue's dying gasp and Raynor's last briefing, as its talons grazed his calf. Then he was through, tumbling onto sun-warmed asphalt that stank of gasoline and thawing permafrost. Vega hauled him upright as the ground convulsed beneath them, the parking lot fracturing in jagged lines that traced the facility's collapsing architecture below. A secondary explosion detonated somewhere in the ruins, heaving a geyser of black smoke into the alpine air. Shaw's vision swam with afterimages, the segmented creature's violet-lit maw, the Wendigo's antlers glistening with thawing frost, until Dawes' grip on his vest straps yanked him back to reality. "Move!" The sergeant's voice was raw, his lips split from the cold. Behind them the parking lot breathed, its asphalt surface rising and falling like a chest as something vast stirred beneath. Vega's flare gun was empty. She threw it anyway. The weapon clattered off a derelict snowcat, its rusted hull weeping orange tears onto the ice. Shaw didn't need to ask, they all heard it. The wet pop of the creature's joints as it unfolded from the fissure behind them, its new hybrid form oozing black ichor that froze midair into barbed crystals. The mountain answered. A tremor rolled through the slope below them, toppling pines in a wave that advanced toward the ruined resort like dominoes. Shaw's teeth vibrated with the sound, not an earthquake but something deeper, a subsonic pulse that made his fillings ache. The creature paused, its too many limbs twitching in unison as it turned its head, first to the collapsing facility, then to the fleeing trio, and smiled with Vega's lips. Dawes' rifle barked once. The round passed clean through the thing's throat without leaving a mark. It didn't flinch. Its borrowed mouth opened, and the mountain's subsonic pulse poured out in perfect mimicry, shaking the snow from nearby branches in synchronized avalanches. Shaw's knees buckled. The sound wasn't just vibration, it was words, compressed into frequencies no human throat could reproduce. You left the door open. Vega dragged him behind a collapsed lift tower as the creature scuttled forward, its movements now synchronized with the tremors. Each step landed precisely between seismic pulses, like a dancer anticipating the beat. Shaw's earpiece fizzed, dead for minutes, then screamed to life with a voice that was neither human nor Wendigo. "Specimen secured, specimen secured, specimen," the recording stuttered, warping into the facility's old evacuation siren before dissolving into white noise. Dawes ejected his spent magazine. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the subsonic pulses still thrumming through the ground. "It's herding us toward the valley," he rasped, jerking his chin toward the tree line where the slope flattened out. The trees there stood perfectly still, their branches frozen mid-sway despite the tremors. Vega's knife flashed as she severed a length of steel cable from the lift's wreckage. Her fingers worked without looking, weaving silver filament from their shredded nets into the strands. Not hurting. The cable hissed as she tested its tension. Learning. A shadow loomed over the tower's rubble. The creature's new form eclipsed the sun, its silhouette flickering between antlered horror and segmented abomination too fast for Shaw's eyes to track. Vega lunged, not at the creature, but at the lift's control panel, her knife jamming into exposed circuitry. The emergency brakes released with a shriek of shearing metal. The creature twisted, its torso spiraling to avoid the collapsing tower, but Vega hadn't aimed for it. The falling debris punched through the weakened ice, revealing the facility's breached UV array beneath, its quartz conduit still pulsing erratically. The creature hesitated. Its hybrid form shuddered, segments briefly reverting to antlers before stabilizing. Shaw's earpiece gurgled, specimen, then static. The tremor beneath them deepened, the pulse now audible, a wet, rhythmic thud like a heart the size of a subway car. The valley trees shivered in unison. The rescue team's thermal signatures had picked them up 40 minutes prior. 3 heat blooms curled like stillborn stars against the snow. When the Blackhawk's rotors finally churned the air above them, Shaw was chewing strips of his own parka lining, convinced the fibers were live wires from Sector 9's shattered consoles. Vega's knife hand still twitched every 2.3 seconds, carving phantom kill boxes into the frost between her knees. Dawes was the only one upright, his pupils wide and black with concussion, repeating the same phrase into a dead radio. Negative on recovery. Sight is asleep. The medics bundled them into the chopper with professional haste, mistaking their flinches for hypothermia rather than the ingrained recoil from things that clicked in the dark. As the helicopter banked away, all 3, without prompting, pressed their foreheads against the same starboard window. Below, the facility's collapse had left a jagged maw in the mountainside, its edges too precise, its shadows stretching wrong even in midday sun. Then the snow moved. Not drifted, rearranged itself in concentric hexagons, folding over the ruins like a sheet drawn over a corpse. Within seconds, there was no evidence anything had ever existed there. "Don't," Vega croaked, when the youngest medic opened his mouth. Her voice wasn't human enough to invite argument. Shaw watched her reflection in the window glass, how her left eye pulsed with the helicopter's vibrations at a frequency that made his molars ache. Dawes exhaled through his nose. The sound unspooled something tight in Shaw's sternum. They'd all heard it, the sergeant's trademark sigh that meant "fuck this" and we're alive in equal measure. The medics exchanged glances when the trio began laughing, wet, gasping chuckles that shook frost from their eyelashes. None of them could explain why. They never spoke of it again. Not during debrief, when facility brass marked their files with black stamps and offered pensions thick enough to choke on. Not when Wolfhound Unit was quietly disbanded 3 weeks later, its memorial plaques relocated to a subbasement no security clearance could access. Especially not when Shaw woke screaming 9 months afterward, his sheets drenched in sweat that froze solid before dawn, his bedroom walls whispering in Rayner's voice, "You left the door open." Vega took up knife throwing. Dawes bought a cabin in Manitoba where the northern lights drowned out the stars. Shaw moved cities 7 times before realizing it wasn't the locations he was fleeing. It was the way subway tunnels hummed at a frequency that made his fillings vibrate like Sector 9's UV array in its death throes. The nightmares were the worst part. Not the blood or the screams or the way his dream self always froze when the creature smiled with his own face, but the certainty, upon waking, that something had laughed along with him in the dark. The Wendigos Hollow. The first time I saw Tessa's hands shake, I thought it was just the cold. We were sitting by the fire, and she kept rubbing her palms together like she was trying to start a spark. Her nails were bitten down to the quick, raw and uneven. "You okay?" I asked, because that's what you do when someone looks like they're holding onto sanity by a thread. She laughed, a sound too sharp, too sudden, and tucked her hands under her armpits. "Peachy," she said, "just peachy." Her breath fogged the air between us, but the firelight caught her eyes just wrong, and for a second they looked glassy like a doll's, the kind you find in a ditch. I should have asked more questions, but the woods were quiet in that way they get before a storm, and the silence felt like a held breath. The trees stood too still, their branches black against the sky. No wind, no animals, just the occasional crackle of the fire and Tessa's teeth chattering. Then she leaned in close, so close I could smell the sweat on her skin, sour like old milk, and whispered, "You ever hear something moving in the dark, Jacob? Not an animal, not anything with a name." Her voice cracked on the last word. "Because I have." And that's when I noticed the scratches on her forearm. 4 thin lines, fresh enough to glisten, like something had dragged its claws down her skin, slow and deliberate. I didn't ask where they came from. Some part of me already knew. The scratches weren't from a branch or a stumble. They were too precise, 4 parallel lines evenly spaced like piano wire dragged through wet clay. I swallowed hard, throat clicking, and reached for my thermos. The coffee was cold. Of course it was. Everything here was cold. Even the fire seemed to burn without warmth, its flames flickering a dull, sullen orange. Tessa watched me, unblinking. Her pupils were wide, swallowing the blue of her irises. "It followed us," she murmured, her voice lower now, almost a growl. "Out of the cave, it knows." She licked her lips, too slow, too deliberate, and I caught a glimpse of her teeth. Sharp, too sharp for a human. The realization hit me like a rifle butt to the ribs. I forced myself to breathe. "What did you see in there?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. The question hung between us, thick as the scent of pine resin and something else, something metallic like old pennies left in the sun. She didn't answer. Instead, her head snapped to the side, ears pricking like a deer's. A twig snapped in the dark, not close, not far. The sound slithered through the trees, deliberate, testing. Tessa's nostrils flared and her breath came faster, ragged. "It's here," she breathed. "It's hungry." The fire spat. Embers spiraled upward, catching in the windless air like dying stars. And then movement, just beyond the ring of light where the shadows pooled thick and restless. A shape, tall, gaunt. It didn't walk. It unfolded, limbs stretching too long, too wrong, the angles all sharp and wrong like a broken marionette. Tessa made a sound, half whimper, half laugh, and her fingers dug into the dirt. "Run," she whispered. But her eyes never left the thing in the dark, and I knew with a clarity that turned my bones to ice that she wasn't talking to me. She was talking to it. The realization hit me like a gut punch. Tessa's fingers curled into the earth, her knuckles white as birch bark, but she wasn't bracing to flee, she was digging in. Her lips peeled back in a grotesque parody of a smile, revealing teeth that glinted like shards of broken glass. The firelight danced across her face, casting shadows that writhed like living things. For a heartbeat, she looked less like a woman and more like something wearing her skin poorly, the edges of her humanity fraying at the seams. Then the woods moved. Not the wind, there was no wind. The trees themselves shuddered, their branches creaking in a chorus of splintering bone. The thing beyond the firelight tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a wet, clicking sound echoing through the clearing. Its eyes caught the light, not reflecting it, but drinking it in, twin pits of absolute blackness set deep in a face stretched too thin over jagged bones. The stench rolled off it in waves, rotting meat, old blood, and beneath it all, the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Tessa's breath came in shallow, panting gasps. Her body trembled, but not from cold, from hunger. I saw it in the way her throat worked, the way her tongue darted out to wet her lips again. Her fingers twitched toward the knife at her belt, my knife, the one I'd let her borrow hours ago when I still thought she was human. The thing in the shadows took a step forward. The ground didn't crunch beneath its feet. It sank, like the earth itself recoiled from its touch. I didn't wait. I lunged for the backpack, fingers scrambling for the flare gun. The motion was too loud, too sudden. Tessa snarled, a sound that belonged in the throat of a rabid wolf, and the thing in the dark lunged. The world exploded in red light as the flare shot past my ear, screaming through the night like a dying star. For one heartbeat, the clearing was bathed in hellish crimson, and I saw them, dozens of them, crowded among the trees, their elongated limbs twisted, their mouths gaping holes of endless hunger. Then the darkness swallowed the light whole, and the screaming began. It wasn't human, not entirely. Tessa's voice twisted into something guttural, halfway between a sob and a howl as her body convulsed in the dirt. I saw her spine arch, heard the wet pop of joints realigning. The knife flashed silver as she brought it down, not toward the creature but toward her own forearm, slicing deep. Blood spattered the pine needles, black in the flare's dying glow. "Can't let it," she gasped, but her words dissolved into a wet, choking sound as her jaw unhinged with an audible crack. The thing from the woods was on me before I could blink. Its fingers, too long, too many joints, closed around my throat, and its breath smelled like an opened grave in midwinter. Up close, its skin wasn't skin at all, but something stretched taut over jagged bone, splitting at the edges to reveal glistening muscle beneath. It leaned in, as if to whisper a secret, and I saw its teeth, row upon row of needle-thin fangs, each tipped with something dark and viscous. Then Tessa hit it from the side like a feral dog. They rolled in a tangle of limbs and snarls, a frenzy of teeth and torn fabric. Something warm hit my cheek, blood or spit, I couldn't tell. The clearing echoed with the sounds of ripping flesh, but I couldn't look away, couldn't move. Because kneeling there in the gore, Tessa's head snapped up, her neck bending at an impossible angle. Her lips were smeared red, her chin dripping. And in her hands, oh God, in her hands was a strip of something pale and sinewy, still twitching. She smiled at me with too many teeth. Behind her the trees rustled, not from wind, from movement, from hunger. The flare gun felt like a toy in my hand. I fumbled for another cartridge, my fingers numb with more than cold. Tessa tilted her head, her blue eyes gone milky white. "Jacob," she crooned, her voice syrup-thick and wrong, "aren't you hungry?" The thing she'd torn from the Wendigo's arm pulsed in her grip like a dying fish. Blood, black as crude oil, dripped between her fingers. Behind her the trees shivered, not with wind, with laughter. The sound wasn't audible. It vibrated through the ground, up my spine, into my molars until my jaw ached. I fired the flare straight up. The explosion of light revealed them, dozens of them, perched in the branches like grotesque fruit. Their limbs bent at insectal angles, their ribcage heaving beneath skin stretched parchment thin. The oldest one, the one missing a strip of flesh, cocked its head. Its jaw unhinged with a wet pop, and it sang. Not a growl, not a scream. A hymn, low and resonant, that made my bones hum in sympathy. Tessa shuddered, her spine arching until her heels touched the back of her head. Her mouth opened, too wide, too wet, and she joined them. The sound wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was the creak of ice over deep water, the groan of a dying tree, the wet suck of meat torn from bone. My ears popped. Warmth trickled down my neck, blood. The flare's dying light cast monstrous shadows that moved independent of their owners. One shadow, long-fingered, sharp-elbowed, reached for me. I stumbled back, tripping over roots that hadn't been there a second ago. The oldest Wendigo dropped from the tree. Its knees bent backward when it landed. Up close, I saw the tattered remains of a park ranger's uniform fused to its flesh. The nameplate read Henry, 1972. The year old man Carter vanished without a trace. Tessa's hand closed around my wrist. Her fingers burned, not with fever, with cold. "You see now, don't you?" she whispered, her breath frosting my cheek. "It's always been here, waiting, choosing." Behind her, Henry's mouth split into a grin, not a smile, a wound. And from the trees a new sound rose, not a hymn, not a howl, the staticky crackle of a radio, my radio, playing my own voice recorded yesterday. "Stay put, Tessa, I'm coming for you." The recording cut off with a scream, mine. But I hadn't screamed yet. The realization hit me as the first sparks from the flare gun kissed the dry pine needles. This was a recording of something that hadn't happened. Or hadn't happened yet. The fire spread faster than I thought possible, licking up the tree trunks in hungry orange tongues, their light casting grotesque shadows that danced with the Wendigo's unnatural movements. Tessa's grip on my wrist tightened, her nails elongating into blackened talons that pierced my parka. "Choose," she hissed, her voice no longer her own but a chorus of whispers layered over winter wind. The flames roared higher, the heat blistering my face, but Henry and the others didn't retreat. They leaned into it, their parchment skin crackling like old leather, their hollow eyes reflecting the inferno with something like reverence. The stench of burning hair and spoiled meat choked me. One of the younger ones, its jaw unhinged like a snake's, stepped too close to the fire. Its flesh blackened, curled, then regrew, the new skin glistening wet and raw in the firelight. My stomach turned. They weren't afraid of the flames. They were feeding on them. Tessa shoved me forward suddenly, her strength inhuman. "Run or burn," she snarled, her lips peeling back too far, too wide. Behind her, the oldest Wendigo, Henry, lifted his hands toward the flames in a mockery of warmth. His fingers were too long, the bones visible through translucent skin, and as he moved I saw the remains of his ranger badge fused to his chest, the metal warped and blackened. His mouth moved, forming words I felt more than heard. "Join us. Starve with us." The fire closed in, its heat searing my boots. Embers spiraled upward, catching in my hair, my clothes. To stay was to burn, to run was to be hunted. I looked at Tessa, really looked, and saw the girl I'd pulled from the cave 3 days ago was gone. Whatever stared back at me now was just another kind of flame, hungry, endless, and cruel. Then the radio crackled again. My own voice ragged with terror. "Don't look behind you." I ran. Not toward the fire, not toward the trees, but somewhere in between where the smoke curled thickest and the Wendigo's hymn faltered just for a heartbeat. My boots pounded the frozen earth, each step sending shockwaves up my spine, but the pain barely registered. The world had narrowed to the stitch in my side and the ragged sound of my own breathing. Behind me, Tessa laughed, a sound like icicles shattering on stone, and the fire roared louder as if fed by her delight. Then dawn broke. The first pale fingers of sunlight filtered through the smoke, painting the forest in shades of ash and bone. I skidded to a stop, chest heaving, and watched the light creep across the ground. It touched the trees, the rocks, the trampled undergrowth, but cast no shadows. None at all, except for mine. My shadow stretched long and black across the frost, far longer than it should have been. And it moved, not with me, without me. Its head turned toward a narrow gap between 2 lightning-struck pines, its arm rising to point with a single elongated finger. The path was barely visible, a deer trail maybe, but the snow there was undisturbed. No footprints, no claw marks, just pristine white powder glittering in the dawn light. A twig snapped behind me, close, too close. I didn't look back. I already knew what I'd see. Tessa, her limbs twisted, her mouth unhinged, her blue eyes gone cataract white. Henry, his badge still fused to his chest, his fingers twitching with the memory of a life long rotted away. The others, their ribs heaving beneath skin stretched taut as drumheads. My shadow beckoned. The first Wendigo hissed, a sound like steam escaping a grave, and the others took up the call, their voices weaving into a chorus that made my teeth ache. But they didn't follow. Not yet. Their heads cocked in unison, their nostrils flaring as if scenting something on the wind, something that made them hesitate. My shadow's fingers curled inward, impatient. I took a step toward the path, then another. Behind me the hymn stuttered, the notes fraying at the edges. The oldest Wendigo, Henry, let out a wet, guttural sound that might have been a word once. A name, my name. I didn't stop. The trail narrowed, the trees pressing in on either side, their branches woven so tightly they blocked out the sky. My shadow led the way, its edges blurring as it slipped between the trunks ahead of me. The air here was different, thinner, sharper, with a taste like cold metal and ozone. The Wendigo's cries grew distant, muffled, as if something in these woods swallowed sound whole. Then my shadow stopped. It turned to face me, its featureless head tilting, and for the first time I realized it wasn't pointing at the path anymore. It was pointing at me. Behind us the forest exhaled, and something answered. My shadow reached out, not toward me, but through me, and the world twisted like wet paint under a palette knife. The trees groaned, their trunks spiraling into impossible shapes, their branches knitting together overhead in a latticework of blackened bone. The sun, seconds ago a pale disk, winked out, then reignited directly above, casting no shadows but my own. I staggered, my boots sinking into fresh snow where none had been moments before. The air tasted different here, younger, fainter, like the first breath drawn after a long sleep. And then I saw it, my own boot prints leading away from the clearing, crisp and undisturbed. My radio, propped against a lightning-scarred pine, sputtered to life with my own voice. "Stay put, Tessa, I'm coming for you." The same words, the same staticky crackle, the same lie. I spun, nausea rising thick in my throat. Behind me the path was gone. In its place stood the cave mouth, dark, yawning, its edges rimed with frost. 3 days ago I'd pulled Tessa from that darkness. Now it yawned wider, exhaling a breath that reeked of wet fur and spoiled meat. My shadow slunk toward it, its edges fraying like smoke. A twig snapped, not from the cave, from the trees to my left, where Tessa had emerged last time, bleeding and babbling about faces in the dark. My fingers clenched around the empty flare gun. Useless. I knew what came next. The choked scream, the panicked rustle of fabric. The moment her flashlight would swing toward me, her blue eyes wide with terror that wasn't entirely her own. But the forest held its breath. Silence. Then laughter. Low, guttural, familiar, not from the trees, not from the cave, from my own throat. I clapped a hand over my mouth, but it spilled between my fingers anyway, thick as tar. My shadow threw back its head and laughed with me, its soundless mirth sending tremors through the snow. The radio hissed, "Don't look behind you." I looked. Tessa stood there, not the trembling girl from 3 days ago, not the ravenous thing by the fire. This Tessa was whole, her cheeks flushed with cold, her scarf knotted tight under her chin. She frowned at me, her flashlight beam catching the steam of her breath. "Jacob," she called, her voice achingly human. "You okay?" My shadow nodded. I opened my mouth to warn her. A hand, mine but not mine, clamped over my lips from behind. Long fingers, black nails. The stench of old blood and burned hair filled my nose. The voice that whispered in my ear was my own, but warped, stretched thin as old tape. "SHHH. It's her turn now." The Blackpine Hunger. Christ Ellie, you look like someone pissed in your tea. Dr. Alina Voss didn't glance up from the mold-spotted ledger she was squinting at under the basement's flickering fluorescence. That's because, she said, tapping a water-stained page, someone did, figuratively. Look at this, 1692 shipping manifest from Portsmouth. Perfectly mundane until this entry. She slid the ledger toward her assistant, Marcus, who leaned in with the dutiful skepticism of a grad student who'd learned not to trust her eureka faces. He adjusted his glasses. 12 crates salted meat, Blackpine settlement, colonial food logistics, thrilling weight. His finger hovered over the cramped marginalia. God help us, they hunger still. That's theatrical. Alina exhaled through her nose. Theatrical is Salem witch trials hysteria. This, she flipped to the next page where the ink bled into indecipherable streaks. This is a record, and I've never heard of Blackpine. Marcus frowned, tracing the ruined edge of the page. You think it's one of those lost settlements, like Roanoke, but meteor. Alina's grin was all teeth. Roanoke left a carving. This, she tapped the ledger, is a confession. The basement's single bulb buzzed overhead, casting long shadows from the archive shelves. Somewhere in the stacks, a pipe groaned. 3 days later, Alina was elbow-deep in colonial shipping records when the email arrived. The sender, one Elias Blackthorn IV, claimed his ancestor had survived Blackpine's unfortunate incident. Attached was a scanned diary entry. The snows came early that year. By December, we ate the dead. By January, the dead ate back. The funding offer came with one condition: no team. Discretion, Blackthorn wrote, is paramount. You're seriously considering this, Marcus hissed as she packed her duffel in the university's glorified supply closet. Some rich weirdo mails you a horror movie plot, and you're, hiking into the Canadian wilderness alone. The duffel zipper snarled shut like a closing trap. Alina rolled her shoulders, the weight of her own recklessness settling between them. Rich weirdos fund archaeology all the time, Marcus. Difference is, this one's honest about the horror movie part. She tossed him her office keys, an arc that made him fumble because she'd practiced that throw all morning. Outside, the Algonquin trapper leaned against her rented Jeep like a gnarled afterthought. His name was Joseph, according to the scrawled note slipped under her motel door that morning. No fire at night, it had read. They smell the smoke. Now he eyed her gear with a chuckle that sounded like a branch breaking under snow. University girl, he said, not unkindly. You pack like you're going to a dig site. Alina's retort died when he flipped open her first aid kit and replaced the antiseptic wipes with a bundled twist of dried moss. For the bleeding, he said, and when she lifted the moss to her nose, earthy, faintly iron-scented, he smacked her hand away. Not yet, you'll know. Marcus hovered at the Jeep's bumper, shifting like he wanted to wrench the door off its hinges. You could at least take a satellite phone. Joseph spat into the dirt, a dark glob that sank into the gravel like a swallowed secret. Phone won't help, he said, flicking a glance at Marcus. No signal where she's going. Only thing that travels fast out there is the hunger. He turned his back on them both, tossing a burlap sack into the Jeep's trunk with a thud that sounded suspiciously like bones clattering. Marcus grabbed Alina's wrist as she reached for the door handle. His fingers were cold despite the late summer heat. You don't even know where Blackpine is, he hissed. Alina pried his hand off, one finger at a time. I know it's north of where anyone bothered to map, she said, and the truth of it buzzed under her ribs like a trapped fly. The coordinates Blackthorn had provided were vague, just a latitude and longitude that hovered over a blank spot on modern surveys. The kind of place cartographers left empty out of superstition rather than ignorance. The Jeep's engine coughed to life. Joseph didn't wave as he pulled away from the curb, leaving Alina standing in a cloud of exhaust and Marcus's unraveling resolve. She watched the Jeep disappear around a corner, the burlap sack sliding ominously in the backseat. Then she shouldered her pack, too light without the archaeology gear she usually hauled, and turned toward the bus station without looking back. The bus north smelled like diesel and the ghost of old cigarettes, its cracked vinyl seats groaning under Alina's weight as she unfolded Blackthorn's map across her knees. The coordinates swam before her eyes, not just a location, but an absence. A hole punched through known geography. Outside, pine forests blurred into a green smear, and she caught herself counting the gaps between trees like a child tallying monsters in the dark. Joseph met her at a derelict gas station 200 miles from anywhere, the Jeep idling like a patient predator. He didn't speak as he loaded her pack into the trunk, but his hands lingered on the burlap sack, fingers tightening briefly around its contours. "You bring meat?" he asked at last, though they both knew she hadn't. Alina's laugh was too sharp. Just trail mix and a lifetime of bad decisions. Joseph grunted and tossed her a rusted hatchet. "Then start praying your bad decisions taste worse than you." The road ended where the trees began, not gradually, but abruptly, as if the forest had drawn a line in the dirt and dared civilization to cross it. Alina stepped out of the Jeep into silence so thick it pressed against her eardrums. No birds, no wind, just the creak of ancient pines shifting their weight overhead. Joseph didn't bother with goodbyes. He tossed her the burlap sack, lighter than it looked but with a wrong, greasy heft, and drove away without glancing back. The Jeep's taillights vanished around a bend, leaving Alina alone with the hatchet in her belt and the sack's contents shifting like a nest of restless snakes. She didn't open it. Some instincts even academics had. The first mile was easy, the second less so. By the third, the trees grew denser, their trunks studded with odd, gnarled protrusions that looked like knuckles clenched around unseen weapons. She paused to catch her breath, leaning against one, and jerked back when her palm came away sticky with sap darker than any pine should bleed. The burlap sack rustled at her hip. Alina wiped the black sap on her pants, staining the khaki fabric with streaks like old blood. The burlap sack shifted again, not a rustle but a deliberate squirm. She untied the rough twine with fingers gone clumsy from cold, peeling back the stiff fabric to reveal what Joseph had packed for her. 3 skinned hares, their flesh gray and glistening, wrapped in strips of bark. The meat smelled faintly of juniper and something metallic, like a butcher's block after a long day's work. A branch snapped somewhere to her left. Alina froze, one hand drifting to the hatchet's handle. The forest held its breath. Then another snap, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable crunch of something stepping deliberately on dry twigs. Not an animal. Animals didn't announce themselves like that. She stuffed the hares back into the sack and moved, keeping her steps light despite the screaming protest of her thighs. The map in her pocket was useless now. Blackpine wasn't the kind of place you found by coordinates. It was the kind of place that found you. The forest thickened into a snarled maze of deadfall and blackberry brambles, their thorns catching Alina's sleeves like skeletal fingers trying to slow her down. The crunching footsteps had stopped, or maybe she just stopped hearing them over the hammer of her own pulse. She paused behind a pine wider than her arm span, pressing her back to its sticky bark. The burlap sack hung heavy at her hip, the hare meat now radiating a low, unnatural warmth through the fabric. A twig snapped directly behind her. Alina didn't turn, didn't breathe. Something cold and slick dripped onto her shoulder, not sap but saliva thick as syrup. The stench hit her next, rotting meat and wet fur, undercut by the sweet sharp reek of gangrene. Slowly she tilted her head upward. The thing perched on the pine's lowest branch wasn't a man, wasn't a bear. Its limbs were too long, its ribcage too pronounced beneath skin stretched drum-tight. Antlers, no, not antlers but jagged bone spurs, curved from its temples. It breathed in wet, heaving gasps, its tongue lolling over needle teeth as it stared down at her with eyes that reflected the fading light like a wolf's. Alina's fingers curled around the hatchet handle, slick with sweat. The thing above her exhaled, a rancid puff of air that stirred the hair at her nape, and she knew with gut-deep certainty that running would only make it pounce. So she did the opposite. She turned slowly, meeting its gaze, and held up the burlap sack like an offering. The creature's nostrils flared. It leaned closer, bone spurs scraping bark, and for a heartbeat, Alina thought it might take the bait. Then its lips peeled back in a grin too wide for a human jaw. "Lean," it rasped, the words slithering out between teeth that clicked like dice in a cup. She hurled the sack into the underbrush. The thing moved fast, a blur of sinew and matted fur, but it went for the meat first, crunching through hairs and bark alike with wet, snapping sounds. Alina ran, branches whipping at her cheeks, her boots sinking into moss that gave way like rotten fruit. Behind her, the chewing stopped. A howl split the air, not hunger but rage. The howl chased Alina through the trees like a second pulse. She crashed through a thicket, thorns tearing at her sleeves, her breath sawing in her throat. The forest ahead blurred, not from exhaustion, but because the trees themselves seemed to shift, trunks twisting subtly to block her path. A root snagged her boot, sending her sprawling into moss that squelched like wet meat beneath her. She rolled onto her back just as the creature landed where she'd fallen, its elongated fingers sinking knuckle-deep into the earth. Up close, its skin wasn't stretched. It was missing in patches, revealing yellowed bone and glistening sinew. The stink of it made her eyes water. Alina swung the hatchet blindly. The blade lodged in its collarbone with a sound like splitting green wood. The thing didn't scream. It laughed, a wet gurgling noise that resolved into words. "Hungry year." Its breath reeked of spoiled hare meat. Alina yanked the hatchet free with a spray of blackish fluid, not blood but something thicker, clinging to the blade like sap. The creature lunged. She sidestepped and it overshot, slamming into a pine. For a heartbeat it seemed dazed. Then it licked the tree, long tongue rasping over bark, and pivoted back toward her with renewed hunger. Alina ran toward a low outcropping of rock, her thighs burning. The creature moved wrong, not sprinting, but flowing across the ground like oil, its joints bending in impossible directions. She scrambled up the rocks, fingernails tearing on lichen. The thing paused at the base, cocking its head like a curious dog. Then it climbed, spidering up the stone face with bone spurs screeching against granite. Alina's heels skidded on wet stone as she hauled herself over the ridge. The creature's breath hit the back of her neck, putrid and hot as a slaughterhouse in August. She threw herself sideways just as its claws scraped granite where her spine had been. The movement sent her tumbling down the far slope in a chaos of bruised elbows and pine needles, the hatchet spinning from her grip. She came to a stop in a hollow where the ground dropped away suddenly. Before her yawned a bowl-shaped clearing, its perimeter ringed by pines that leaned inward like spectators to an arena, and at its center, Blackpine. Not ruins, but intact. Wooden cabins with shuttered windows, a church steeple spearing the twilight. The settlement looked less abandoned than paused, as if its inhabitants had simply stepped out mid-chore. An iron pot hung unmoved over a cold fire pit. The creature's screech tore through the air behind her, closer than she'd hoped. Alina lunged for the nearest cabin, boots slipping on frost-rimed grass. The door groaned open on hinges that shouldn't have survived 3 centuries. Inside, the smell hit her first, beeswax and mildewed wool, undercut by something meatier. A single shaft of dusty light revealed 11 figures kneeling in prayer around a 12th empty space. Their skin had dried tight to their bones, lips peeled back in eternal grins. A child's skeleton lay by the hearth, finger bones splayed around a charcoal sketch. That same spindled creature, its antlers branching like a cancer. Alina's throat tightened. She'd seen this before, the Wendigo myth, Algonquin starvation spirits, but myths didn't leave claw marks on pine. The cabin door slammed shut behind her with a groan of ancient wood. Alina's breath came in ragged bursts, her fingers numb where they clutched the hatchet's splintered handle. Outside, the creature's footsteps circled, deliberate, unhurried. The click-click of bones spurs on frozen earth. Alina edged toward the mummified congregation. Their kneecaps had fused to the floorboards, tendons shriveled to black twine. The empty space in their circle yawned at her. 12th crate, she thought wildly. The ledger's missing shipment. A floorboard creaked overhead. She froze. The attic. Something was up there, not the creature outside, but something older. The stench of rancid fat dripped through the ceiling cracks. Eleanor's pulse hammered in her teeth as she reached for the ladder, a rickety thing of lashed branches. But the moment her boot touched the first rung, the creature outside screeched. Not anger, warning. The ladder shuddered under Eleanor's weight like a living thing resisting her. Above, the attic exhaled, a slow, wet sound, as if something enormous had just licked its lips. Her fingers slipped on a rung slick with old grease, and for a sickening second, she hung suspended between the thing below and the thing above. The creature outside slammed into the cabin wall with a thud that shook dust from the rafters. "Mine!" It hissed through the gaps in the logs, its voice the scrape of bone on bone. The attic answered with a low, bubbling chuckle that resolved into words. "Ours." Eleanor dropped back to the floor just as the attic hatch splintered inward. A rope, no, a tongue, thick as her wrist and glistening with mucus, lashed down, wrapping around her ankle with the grip of a strangler vine. She swung the hatchet blindly. The blade bit deep, severing the tongue with a spray of foul liquid that sizzled where it struck the floorboards. The attic howled, the sound shaking the cabin like a gale. Outside, the creature shrieked in answer, not in sympathy, but triumph. Eleanor scrambled backward as the severed tongue writhed at her feet, its severed end sprouting needle-thin teeth that gnashed at the air. She kicked it toward the hearth, where it curled and blackened like burning parchment. The attic's howl dwindled into wet, choking gurgles, but the silence that followed was worse. Eleanor pressed her back against the cabin wall, her pulse hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, the creature's footsteps had stopped. The click-click of bone spurs was gone. Then the scratching began. Not at the door, not at the walls, underneath. Claws digging up through the floorboards between her boots, splinters raining upward as something burrowed. Eleanor lunged for the hearth, the only part of the floor not made of wood, just as the creature's hand erupted through the planks, fingers splayed like a spider's legs. Its palm was split down the middle by a lipless mouth, teeth gnashing at the air where her ankle had been. The attic hissed. The floorboards heaved. Eleanor grabbed the iron pot from its hook and swung. The impact sent the creature's arm snapping back through the hole with a sound like green branches breaking. Black fluid geysered upward, hitting her cheek, cold as grave dirt. She wiped it away with a gasp, only for the attic's severed tongue to lash around her wrist, its new-grown teeth sinking deep. Eleanor's scream tore through the cabin as the tongue's teeth grated against bone. She clawed at it with her free hand, fingernails peeling back strips of rubbery flesh that reknitted instantly. The iron pot slipped from her grip, clanging against the hearthstones, and the creature beneath the floorboards laughed, a sound like rats scrambling in a hollow wall. The attic hatch burst outward in a rain of splinters. Something enormous and pallid as a skinned calf poured down, its limbs boneless, its face a featureless slab except for the vertical slit of its mouth, now gaping wide enough to swallow a man whole. The tongue around Eleanor's wrist yanked her forward, toward that waiting maw. She planted her boots against the hearthstones and pulled, muscles screaming. The tongue stretched taut, then snapped, sending her sprawling backward into the kneecaps of the mummified congregation. Their brittle bones shattered under her weight, releasing a cloud of dust that smelled of old parchment and spoiled lard. The creature from the attic wailed, clutching its severed tongue stump. The floorboards exploded upward as the Wendigo surged through, its antlers scraping the ceiling. It ignored Eleanor entirely, lunging for the skinned attic thing with a snarl. The two monstrosities collided in a tangle of teeth and talons, the Wendigo's bone spurs punching through pallid flesh like skewers. Black fluid geysered across the pews. Eleanor scrambled backward as the creatures tore into each other, their shrieks vibrating the cabin walls like a struck gong. The attic thing's severed tongue still twitched around her wrist, its teeth embedded deep. She grabbed the iron pot and smashed it down, once, twice, until the thing loosened with a wet pop. Black ooze dribbled from the puncture wounds left behind. The Wendigo had the attic thing pinned, its elongated fingers sunk wrist-deep into the pallid flesh. With a sound like a gutted deer's last breath, it ripped downward, peeling the creature open like a rotten fruit. What spilled out wasn't guts but a writhing mass of severed tongues, each tipped with needle teeth. They lashed at the Wendigo's face, drawing streaks of that same black fluid. Alina didn't wait to see who'd win. She lunged for the door, shoulder-checking it open into the freezing night. The clearing was different now. The perimeter pines leaned closer, their branches tangled like clasped hands. Something crunched under her boot. A pinecone split open to reveal tiny, pebble-like teeth inside. She ran for the church. Its steeple tilted at a drunken angle, the bell long gone. Inside, the pews were overturned, hymnals scattered like gutted birds. The altar cloth had rotted to lace, revealing symbols carved beneath, not crosses but spirals that made her vision swim. A child's skeleton lay curled in the baptismal font, its finger bones clutching a rusted bell. The bell clattered to the stone floor when Alina brushed the skeleton's ribs, a sound too sharp, too present for something that should have been dust centuries ago. The moment it struck the ground, the wind outside changed. Not a howl, a whisper, threading through the church's gaps like a cold finger down her spine. They rang it at supper. Alina spun. The voice came from the pulpit, no, from the shadow of the pulpit where the Wendigo crouched, its antlers scraping the rafters. Its mouth didn't move. The words just appeared in her skull, oily and insistent. Called us to table, fed us until we fed ourselves. Black fluid dripped from its collarbone wound, sizzling where it hit the hymnals. Alina backed toward the font, her boots crunching on brittle pages. The child's skeleton watched her with hollow sockets. The child's jawbone clacked shut with a sound like ice cracking underfoot. Alina flinched as the tiny skeleton sat up in the baptismal font, its vertebrae clicking into place like beads on a string. Its finger bones scrabbled at the rusted bell, lifting it with unnatural precision. The Wendigo didn't move, just watched, its breath steaming in the sudden cold. The bell rang once, a tinny, rust-choked sound that shouldn't have carried weight, but Alina felt it in her teeth. Outside, the pines shuddered. The child's skeleton turned its skull toward the pulpit, jaw working soundlessly before the words slithered into Alina's mind like worms. Grace was said here. The Wendigo's claws flexed against the pulpit wood, splinters curling beneath its grip. Grace, it echoed, and the word tasted of old blood and pine resin. They said grace while the meat still screamed in the cellar. The child's bell hand trembled. Alina's own wrist throbbed where the tongue teeth had pierced, the punctures weeping thin, clear fluid. She edged sideways toward the shattered stained glass window just as the Wendigo's head snapped toward her. Its nostrils flared. "Not you," it hissed. "Not yet." The stained glass shards crunched under Alina's boots as she backed toward the window. The child's skeleton tilted its head, the rusted bell swaying gently in its grip. Then, impossibly, it smiled, the bones of its face rearranging into something too knowing, too hungry. The Wendigo lunged, not at Alina but at the skeleton, its claws closing around the tiny ribcage with a sound like snapping twigs. The bell hit the floor with a clang that reverberated through the church, shaking dust from the rafters. Outside, the pines moaned, their branches twisting against each other like arthritic fingers. Alina didn't wait. She threw herself through the jagged remains of the window, glass tearing at her sleeves. The freezing air hit her like a slap, sharp with the scent of pine and something darker, copper and spoiled milk. She landed hard on the frost-crusted grass, rolling just in time to see the church doors burst outward in a shower of splinters. The Wendigo emerged, the child's skull clutched in one elongated hand. Its other arm ended at the elbow, severed cleanly black fluid crystallizing in the cold. It didn't glance at Alina, just lifted the tiny skull to its lipless mouth and bit down, teeth shearing through bone like parchment. The crunch of the child's skull between the Wendigo's teeth sent Alina scrambling backward, her palms skidding on frozen grass. The thing didn't chase her. It just stood there, chewing methodically, flecks of bone catching in the matted fur around its neck. A wet, clicking sound came from its throat, not a growl but a purr. Alina's breath fogged the air in ragged bursts. The church's shattered window gaped behind her like a broken tooth, the edges glittering with frost. Inside, shadows moved, not the attic thing's boneless thrashing, but something taller, stepping over the wrecked pews with the deliberate pace of a priest approaching the altar. The Wendigo's head snapped up. Its nostrils flared, sniffing the air, then it flinched, dropping the skull fragments as if scalded. The thing in the church doorway wasn't human, wasn't the attic creature either. It wore a tattered minister's robe, the fabric straining over limbs too long for the sleeves. Where its face should have been, there was only smooth, poreless skin stretched tight over the hint of a scream. Alina's muscles locked. Every instinct screamed to run, but the clearing's perimeter pines had knotted their branches tighter, forming a cage of splintered wood. The minister thing lifted a hand, fingers fused together into a single, spade-like appendage, and pointed at the Wendigo. The Wendigo whined. The sound crawled up Alina's spine like a wet finger dragging along vertebrae. It backed away from the minister thing, its remaining arm raised in a parody of surrender. The minister's spade hand twitched, and the Wendigo folded, collapsing onto its knees with a crunch of frozen cartilage. Alina's pulse hammered against her ribs. The minister's blank face turned toward her, not toward, asterisk past asterisk her, to the splintered window. The jagged glass shards trembled, then lifted, hovering in the air like a halo of broken teeth. They rotated slowly, points aligning with Alina's throat. A pinecone skittered across the frost. The minister's head tilted, just slightly, and the glass shards clattered to the ground. Behind it, the church's remaining stained glass window darkened, the colors leaching away as if something inside were drinking the light. The Wendigo whimpered, pressing its forehead to the dirt. Alina edged sideways, her boots scraping frozen grass. The minister's hand twitched again. The Wendigo moved, a blur of matted fur and snapping joints, its remaining hand closing around Alina's ankle before she could react. Its claws pierced her jeans, pricking skin. "Lean Winter," it rasped, the words bubbling up from its collarbone wound. Alina's scream lodged in her throat as the Wendigo's claws tightened, hot blood trickling into her boot. The minister thing took a single step forward. Its robe didn't move with it, hanging limp as a shed skin while the body beneath advanced. The pines groaned in unison, their trunks bending like bows drawn taut. The Wendigo yanked her backward with a jerk that popped her knee. "Run when it blinks," it hissed, not with its mouth. Its teeth were still clamped around the child's femur, but from the gash in its chest, the words vibrating through her bones like a struck tuning fork. The minister thing's face rippled. For half a second, the smooth skin split vertically, not a blink, but a tear, revealing a wet darkness that smelled of turned earth and amniotic fluid. Alina wrenched free, scrambling toward the nearest cabin as the clearing erupted behind her. The sound wasn't a roar. It was the opposite, a vacuum of noise that sucked the air from her lungs. Cabin doors burst inward in unison, their hinges screaming. Alina dove through the nearest threshold just as the minister thing's spade hand speared the space where her spine had been. She rolled behind a toppled dresser, its drawers vomiting moth-eaten linens. The dresser shook as something heavy slammed into it, sending a porcelain wash basin crashing to the floorboards. Alina crouched lower, her breath coming in shallow, silent hitches. The minister thing's footsteps circled outside, slow, deliberate, the creak of its fused fingers dragging along the cabin wall like a blade being sharpened. A shadow darkened the shattered window, not the Wendigo's hunched silhouette, but something taller, its outline bleeding at the edges like ink in water. The minister thing's breath fogged the broken glass, warm, rancid, carrying the sweet-rot stench of a gutted deer left to bloat in the sun. Alina's fingers closed around a rusted fireplace poker lying in the ashes. The metal was pitted with age, but the weight felt good in her grip. Outside, the footsteps paused. The cabin's front door groaned inward on hinges that hadn't moved in centuries. Moonlight spilled across the threshold, illuminating the minister thing's bare feet, too long. The toes fused into a single, spade-like appendage that left wet prints on the floorboards. Its robe rustled, though no wind stirred the dust. Alina held her breath as the shadow stretched toward her hiding place, the hem of the robe brushing the overturned dresser. The fireplace poker trembled in Alina's grip. The minister thing's robe brushed the dresser, fabric whispering against wood like a serpent sliding through dry grass. Then, silence. The wet footprint stopped inches from her hiding spot. A drop of something thick and dark fell onto the floorboards with a sound like a hammer striking wet clay. Alina's pulse throbbed in her punctured wrist. The minister thing exhaled, a long, rattling sigh that stirred the dust motes in the moonlight. Its fused toes flexed, claws extending with a series of faint clicks. The dresser shuddered as it leaned its weight forward. The poker slipped in Alina's sweaty palm. She adjusted her grip silently, the rusted metal biting into her fingers. The minister thing's shadow stretched longer, its outline bleeding into the walls like smoke. A floorboard creaked under its shifting weight. Then a scream tore through the night. Not human, not Wendigo. The sound was glass shattering underwater, vibrating the cabin walls. The minister thing's head snapped toward the door, its blank face rippling like disturbed mercury. Outside, something crashed through the pines with the force of a felled tree. The minister thing whipped around, its robe flaring like the wings of a startled crow. Alina didn't hesitate. She lunged from behind the dresser, driving the fireplace poker into the back of its knee with every ounce of strength left in her trembling arms. The metal punched through sinew with a wet crunch, lodging deep. The creature didn't scream. It folded, collapsing onto its fused hands with the grace of a marionette with cut strings. Its head lolled backward, the smooth skin of its face splitting vertically like a rotten fruit, revealing a wet black maw lined with concentric rings of needle teeth. The stench of spoiled communion wine poured out, thick enough to coat Alina's tongue. She yanked the poker free and bolted for the door as the minister thing's spade hand scrabbled at the floorboards, its body twisting bonelessly to face her. Moonlight caught the thing inside its gaping mouth, a pulsing, glandular mass that throbbed like a second heart. Outside, the clearing was chaos. The Wendigo writhed in the grip of something enormous, a tangle of antlers and glistening tendons that towered over the pines. It wasn't one creature, Alina realized with dawning horror, but many, their bodies fused together in a grotesque parody of the Blackpine congregation. The Wendigo's remaining arm disappeared into their collective mass with a sound like roots tearing through soft earth. Alina's boots skidded on frost as she fled the cabin, the minister thing's wet gasps chasing her. The fused congregation loomed ahead, not hunting the Wendigo, but absorbing it, their collective flesh pulsing where the creature's limbs vanished inside them. The Wendigo's antlers protruded at odd angles from the mass, twitching like insect antennae tasting the air. She veered left toward the churchyard, where the child's scattered bones gleamed in the moonlight. A root snagged her ankle. No, not a root, but the minister thing's elongated fingers, stretching impossibly from the cabin doorway. Alina hacked at the grasping hand with the poker, severing two fingers that wriggled in the dirt like gutted worms. The fused congregation shuddered. A new mouth split open across their collective chest, the Wendigo's lipless maw, now lined with rows of human teeth stolen from the Blackpine dead. "Run!" it gurgled through borrowed vocal cords. The word sprayed black fluid that sizzled where it struck Alina's jacket. She sprinted past the baptismal font just as the minister thing erupted from the cabin, its torn robe flapping like bat wings. Its gait was all wrong, joints bending backward, spade feet punching holes in the frozen earth. The fused congregation turned in unison, their many faces pressing outward from the mass like prisoners pushing at a rubber wall. Eleanor's lungs burned as she vaulted over the churchyard fence, her boots crunching through the child's scattered rib bones. Behind her, the minister thing's spade feet punched holes in the earth with each loping stride. The fused congregation shuddered forward like a living landslide, their collective flesh undulating around the Wendigo's half-digested form. The church bell clanged once-twice, though no hand struck it. The sound vibrated through Eleanor's teeth like a struck tuning fork. The minister thing faltered mid-step, its blank face rippling as if disturbed by an unseen current. The congregation's advance slowed, their many mouths slackening in unison. Eleanor didn't pause. She sprinted past the ruined altar, her fingers closing around the rusted bell rope dangling from the belfry. The fibers bit into her bleeding palm as she yanked with all her weight. The bell tolled a third time, the note deeper, richer, a sound that shouldn't have come from corroded metal. The minister thing shrieked, a sound like ice splitting underfoot. Its robe billowed as it clutched its featureless face, the fabric tearing along seams that shouldn't have existed. The fused congregation convulsed, their collective mass splitting along fissures that leaked black, syrupy fluid. The bell's third toll cracked the minister thing's face like thin ice underfoot. Black fluid geysered from the fissure, splattering the frozen grass where it sprouted tiny, writhing tongues. Eleanor's arms trembled as she clung to the rope, the fibers sawing into her torn palms. The fused congregation let out a collective moan, not pain, but hunger, their many mouths gnashing in unison. The Wendigo's antlers burst from the mass in a spray of viscous fluid, its skull half-emerged like a diver breaking surface. Its remaining eye rolled wildly before locking onto Eleanor. Again, it rasped through borrowed teeth. She yanked the rope with a sob. The bell's fourth toll shook the belfry, sending centuries of dust snowing down. The sound hit the minister thing like a physical blow. Its spade feet skidded backward, tearing furrows in the earth. Its robe split along the seams, revealing not flesh but a writhing nest of severed tongues, each tipped with needle teeth. The fused congregation shuddered. Their edges melted, bodies sloughing together like candle wax. The Wendigo wrenched free with a wet pop, its bones visible through patches of rotting fur. It lunged, not at Eleanor but at the minister thing's flapping robe, sinking its teeth into the squirming tongues beneath. Eleanor didn't wait to see who won. She sprinted past the convulsing monstrosities toward the tree line, her boots kicking up frozen clods of earth. The bell's resonance still thrummed in her bones, not sound but memory, some deep ancestral recognition that made her teeth ache. The first pinecone hit her shoulder with a wet thwap, then another and another, raining from the branches like shrapnel. They burst on impact, each one vomiting up a writhing knot of pale worms that squirmed against her jacket. Eleanor batted at them frantically, her fingers coming away smeared with something that smelled of fermented sap and copper. Behind her the battle sounds changed. The wet tearing gave way to a sound like glaciers calving, immense, implacable. She risked one glance back. The minister thing's robe had engulfed the Wendigo completely, fabric stretching obscenely around the struggling form within. The fused congregation simply melted, their collective mass flowing into the earth like black syrup. Then the ground moved. Eleanor's boots sank into the suddenly porous earth as the soil beneath her rippled like a living thing. The pinecone stopped falling. The worms froze mid-squirm. Even the wind held its breath. Then the ground breathed, a deep, shuddering inhale that pulled the roots of the perimeter pines taut like harp strings. The minister thing's robe went limp, collapsing empty onto the churned earth. The Wendigo was gone. The fused congregation was gone. Only the bell's echo remained, thrumming through Eleanor's molars as she staggered toward the tree line. Her left boot stuck fast in the sucking mud. She wrenched it free with a wet pop just as the soil where she'd stood opened, a yawning pit exhaling the scent of turned earth and spoiled lard. Something brushed her ankle, not a root, not a worm, fingers skeletal and endless rising from the pit in a writhing column. They scraped along her jeans with the dry rasp of beetles' legs, probing the wounds left by the Wendigo's claws. Eleanor swung the rusted poker. The metal passed through the fingers like smoke, stirring nothing but a whisper. Hungry. The word wasn't spoken. It unfolded inside her skull, each syllable bloated with the weight of centuries. The pit widened, its edges crumbling inward as more fingers emerged, thousands upon thousands, knuckle bones clicking together like dice in a gambler's cup. They wove themselves into a ladder stretching up toward the treetops, where the pines now leaned away at impossible angles, their trunks bent like supplicants bowing to a king. The finger ladder creaked as it bore weight, not Eleanor's. Something was climbing up from the pit. She backpedaled, her heel catching on a half-buried hymnal. The book fell open to a page warped by moisture, the ink bleeding into a single word. Come. The skeletal fingers twitched in unison, their phalanges elongating like taffy to bridge the gap between the pit's edge and her bleeding wrist. Eleanor swung the poker. It passed harmlessly through the bones, but the motion disturbed a pinecone clinging to her collar. It burst against her cheek, releasing a squirming larva that latched onto her earlobe with needle jaws. She ripped it free with a gasp, flinging it toward the pit, where the fingers caught it midair and drew it downward with the reverence of a communion wafer. The ground shuddered. The pit exhaled a breath that reeked of lye and lard, and the finger ladder twisted, bones reconfiguring into a spiraling staircase. At its base, something pale and many-jointed began its ascent. Eleanor's breath hitched as the thing emerged from the pit, not climbing but unfolding, its limbs extending in segmented jerks like a spider testing a new web. Moonlight glistened off its patchwork skin, stitched together from strips of hide and something darker, glistening wetly between the seams. Where a face should have been, there was only a hollowed-out stretch of scalp, the skin puckered where features had been removed. The finger staircase groaned under its weight. Pinecones rained down around Eleanor, bursting against the frozen earth to release their wriggling contents. She stumbled backward, the rusted poker slipping in her sweaty grip. The thing paused mid-step, its head tilting toward her with avian precision. A sound leaked from its neck stump, not a voice, but the wet pop of a dislocated joint snapping back into place. Eleanor. The name didn't come from the pit creature. It vibrated up through the soil, thrumming in her bones like a plucked string. The scattered pages of the hymnal trembled, their ink rearranging into jagged letters. You shouldn't be lean in winter. The hymnal pages rustled like starving mouths. Eleanor's pulse hammered against the punctures on her wrist, each throb squeezing out thin, clear fluid that dripped onto the frozen earth. The drops sizzled where they landed, etching tiny craters in the frost. The pit creature took another step upward, its stitched limbs creaking like old leather. Behind it, the finger staircase dissolved and reformed with each movement, bones clicking into new configurations like some grotesque puzzle solving itself in real time. Eleanor's boothiel scraped backward and struck something solid. The rusted church bell lay half-buried in the dirt, its rim jagged where centuries of freezing and thawing had split the metal. She crouched without breaking eye contact with the advancing creature, fingers closing around the bell's broken edge. Cold seared her palm, but she held on. The pit creature paused. Its headless torso leaned forward, stitched seams straining as if sniffing the air. The hymn pages fluttered faster, their letters rearranging again. Ring it and see. Eleanor's fingers trembled around the bell's fractured edge. The metal bit into her palm, mixing her blood with decades of oxidized grime. The pit creature took another jerking step forward, its stitched knees popping like green wood in a fire. She swung the bell with all her remaining strength. It struck the frozen earth with a dull clunk, no resonance, no echo. The pit creature didn't flinch. The hymn pages stopped rustling midair, their letters dissolving into meaningless smudges. Then silence. A pinecone dropped from the bent pines, bursting at the creature's feet. The worms inside writhed for a single frantic moment before shriveling to black dust. The pit creature's stitched torso shuddered. Its right arm twitched, the stitches along its elbow splitting with wet snaps as the limb elongated toward Eleanor. Eleanor's breath crystallized in the air as the stitched limb stretched toward her, seams popping like overstressed threads. The bell's broken edge trembled in her grip, useless against the advancing horror, until she remembered the child's skeleton clutching its rusted counterpart in the baptismal font. She flung the bell at the pit creature's chest. It struck with a hollow thunk embedding in the stitched flesh. No blood, no recoil, just the creature tilting its headless torso as if puzzled by this new adornment. Then the churchyard erupted in sound. Not from the pit creature, not from the bell, from every bell that had ever rung in Blackpine's history, a cacophony of tones vibrating up through the frozen earth, shaking pine needles loose in a glittering rain. The pit creature's stitches burst like overripe fruit, its limbs unraveling into strips of jerky-like flesh that slapped wetly against the ground. The unraveling creature collapsed in on itself, its stitches popping like overstressed seams in a rotten sail. The bell tones swelled, not from the air, but from Eleanor's own bones, vibrating up through her boots as the frozen earth hummed like a struck tuning fork. The pit yawned wider, its edges crumbling inward as the skeletal fingers retracted with the haste of startled spiders. Eleanor stumbled back as the first tremor hit. The church's remaining stained glass exploded outward in a shower of colored shards, each fragment reflecting not the moon, but a different face, Blackpine's lost congregation, their mouths stretched in silent screams. The hymnal pages fluttered madly, their ink rearranging into a single phrase over and over. They ate the bells, they ate the bells, they ate. The pit creature's remains slithered toward the abyss, its strips of flesh squirming like dying eels. Then the ground inhaled, a sucking pull that dragged the writhing mass downward. Eleanor grabbed a pine root as the earth bucked, her boots skidding toward the collapsing edge. The root snapped. She slid forward, fingernails gouging frost-hardened soil, and caught the rusted bell's broken rim just as the pit sealed with a sound like a giant's teeth clashing. Silence. Eleanor lay sprawled on the frozen earth, the bell's jagged rim still clutched in her bleeding hand. The silence was absolute. No wind, no creaking pines, not even the sound of her own breath. She rolled onto her knees, expecting the ground to heave again. It didn't. The churchyard was empty. No pit, no writhing fingers. Only the scattered pages of the hymnal remained, their ink now faded to the color of old blood. Eleanor reached for the nearest page. It crumbled at her touch, revealing a single intact phrase beneath. Grace is meet. A twig snapped behind her. She whirled, bell raised like a shield. The Wendigo stood 3 paces away, its remaining arm gone now, antlers snapped at the bases, ribs visible through patches of rotting fur. It didn't attack, just stared at her with its one remaining eye, the pupil dilated wide enough to swallow the moon whole. The Wendigo's tongue lolled from its lipless mouth, black, forked, and glistening with the same corrosive fluid that had eaten through its chest wound. It took a limping step forward, its remaining eye fixed not on Eleanor's face, but on the rusted bell fragment in her hand. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the metal. The Wendigo exhaled, a rattling sigh that smelled of spoiled venison and wet charcoal. Then it spoke, the words bubbling up from its collarbone gash. You rang them. The voice wasn't its own. It was layered, a chorus of whispers, some young, some old, all hungry. The hymnal page crumpled in Eleanor's other hand. The Wendigo's nostrils flared as the paper disintegrated, its head jerking toward the vanishing ink like a dog catching a scent. Grace, it hissed, the word dripping with something between reverence and revulsion. A gust of wind stirred the pine needles overhead. The Wendigo's ear twitched, a tattered, leathery thing more whole than flesh, but it didn't turn toward the sound. Its focus remained on the bell shard, its pupil contracting slightly as moonlight glinted off the pitted metal. Aliner's knuckles whitened around the bell fragment. The Wendigo's gaze flickered, not to her face but to her wrist, where blood dripped onto the frost. Its nostrils flared. "Grace is meat," it rasped, echoing the hymnal's words with a guttural inflection that turned them into something obscene. The wind shifted. A pinecone dropped between them, bursting open to release a squirming larva. The Wendigo's head snapped down, its remaining arm darting forward with startling speed. But instead of attacking, it pinned the wriggling thing to the ground with a single claw. "Eat," it commanded, pushing the larva toward Aliner with a grotesque approximation of hospitality. Aliner didn't move. The Wendigo's eye narrowed. Then, with a wet pop, its collarbone wound split wider, extruding a glistening tendril of black muscle that lashed out not at her but at the scattered hymnal pages. The tendril stabbed through the paper, retracting with a shred of parchment impaled on its tip. "They wrote the recipes," the Wendigo whispered, offering the paper like a sacrament. Aliner edged backward. The Wendigo's tendril retracted with a wet slurp. "No fire at night," it said suddenly, tilting its head at a sharp angle. "You followed the rule. Clever meat." Its tongue lolled, dripping black fluid onto the frost where it sizzled like grease on a skillet. The larva writhed between them, its segmented body glistening under the moonlight. Aliner's stomach turned as the Wendigo nudged it closer with a claw, its eye unblinking. "Eat," it repeated, the word thick with something like anticipation. A pinecone burst overhead, raining down more larvae. The Wendigo's head snapped up, its nostrils flaring at the scent. Aliner seized the distraction. She lunged sideways, rolling through the frost to grab a fallen branch. The wood was rotten, but it would burn. The Wendigo whirled, its pupil contracting to a pinprick. "No fire," it shrieked, the sound tearing from its throat in jagged syllables. But Aliner was already striking her ferro rod, sparks cascading onto the tinder. The first flame caught with a hiss, eating hungrily at the damp bark. The Wendigo recoiled as if struck, its elongated limbs folding inward. The larvae stopped squirming. The wind died. Even the pines seemed to hold their breath as the firelight painted the clearing in flickering amber. The firelight didn't behave right. It clung to the branch like syrup, casting shadows that slithered against the ground instead of retreating. The Wendigo didn't flee. It folded, its ribs collapsing inward as if trying to compact itself into something smaller, less noticeable. Its remaining eye rolled wildly, pupil dilating until the black swallowed the fire's reflection hole. Aliner held the burning branch aloft. The flames whispered as they climbed higher, their crackling forming words. "Grace is meat." She nearly dropped it. The Wendigo whimpered, a sound too human to come from that lipless mouth. The fire surged. Shadows pooled around her boots like spilled ink. From the darkness, fingers emerged, not skeletal but familiar. A child's hand, its skin bluish and puckered from centuries in frozen earth, closed around her ankle. The same hand that had clutched the rusted bell in the baptismal font. Aliner kicked free, stumbling back as more hands breached the shadow pool. Small hands, starved hands. They groped blindly, their fingernails scraping against the frost in a rhythm that matched the fire's whispered chant. The Wendigo pressed its forehead to the ground, its antler stumps trembling. The child's fingers curled into Aliner's bootlaces, tugging with surprising strength. The fire's whisper intensified. "Grace is meat, grace is meat, grace is," until the words blurred into a single hissing note. The Wendigo pressed its face deeper into the frozen earth, its remaining eye squeezed shut. Aliner swung the burning branch at the grasping hands. The flames recoiled before making contact, twisting away from the small blue fingers as if repelled by an unseen force. The child's grip tightened. A second hand emerged from the shadow pool, this one clutching a rusted tin cup half filled with blackened teeth. The Wendigo let out a wet, choking sound. Its collarbone wound split wider, extruding a glistening tendril that lashed toward the cup, not to take it, but to caress the tarnished metal with grotesque reverence. The moment the tendril made contact, the The teeth inside chattered like dice in a gambler's fist. Alina stomped down on the child's wrist. The bones snapped with a dry crack, but the fingers didn't loosen. The fire roared suddenly, its flames licking upward in a spiraling column that cast no light, only deeper shadows that stretched toward the pines. Where the darkness touched, the trees bent, their trunks creaking as they leaned away from something unseen. The fire's whispered chant died mid-syllable as Alina's vision tunneled. The child's broken wrist twisted in her grip, bones grinding like pebbles in a tin can. Then the shadows moved, not retreating from the flames, but consuming them, the darkness swallowing the firelight in gulps until only embers remained, pulsing like dying stars. The Wendigo uncurled with a wet click of joints. Its remaining eye reflected the last ember's glow as it whispered, "They're coming." Alina's boot came free with a sickening pop. She staggered backward, the hymnal page crumpling in her fist. The child's hand retreated into the shadow pool, dragging the tin cup of chattering teeth after it. The Wendigo's tendril lashed out, not to stop the retreat, but to lick the cup's rim with a blackened tongue, its pupil dilating at the taste. Then the pines screamed. Not wind, not branches. The trees themselves shuddered, their trunks splitting vertically to reveal glistening vocal cords of sap and resin. The sound hit Alina like a physical blow, vibrating her teeth until she tasted copper. The Wendigo clapped its claws over its ear holes, its collarbone wound spewing black fluid with each concussive wave. The scream of the pines dissolved into silence, the kind that presses against eardrums like wet wool. Alina blinked blood from her eyelashes. The hymnal page still stuck to her palm, its ink bleeding into her frostbite cracks. The Wendigo was gone. The shadow pool was gone. Only the rusted bell shard remained, wedged between two roots like a fallen tombstone. Her boots crunched through frozen ferns as she staggered toward the tree line. Each step sent jagged pain up her calves, not from the cold, but from the dozens of pine needle scratches that now oozed clear fluid. The forest smelled wrong. Not pine, not decay, like lye and lard boiling in an iron pot. The first radio-static crackle made her flinch. It came from nowhere and everywhere, the white noise resolving into a voice, not the Wendigo's layered rasp, but a man's voice, tinny and alarmed. "Anyone copy? We've got a heat signature near Blackpine Creek." Alina's knees buckled. She caught herself on a birch trunk, her fingers sinking into the bark like it was rotten fruit. The radio voice continued, closer now. "Christ, it's freezing out here." A branch snapped. Alina whirled, bell shard raised. The figure that emerged from the pines wore a Parks Canada jacket, its orange fabric garish against the monochrome forest. The ranger's breath plumed as he took in her torn clothes, the hymnal page, the way her pupils swallowed the scant moonlight whole. The ranger's radio squawked again. "Mike, confirm visual on target." But he didn't respond. His gloved hand hovered near his bare spray as he took in Alina's matted hair, the way her fingers twitched around the rusted bell shard. His breath fogged the air between them in short, nervous bursts. Alina tried to speak. Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth, tacky with dehydration and something darker. The hymnal page crumbled in her other fist, its ink smearing across her frostbite cracks like old bloodstains. The ranger, Mike, his name tag said, flinched when her knees gave out. He caught her elbow before she face-planted into the snow. "Jesus, you're freezing," he muttered, shrugging out of his parka to wrap around her shoulders. The synthetic fabric reeked of detergent and wood smoke. Alina gagged. "No fire at night," the Wendigo had said. Mike's radio crackled again. This time, a woman's voice. "Thermals picking up movement 200 yards north of your position." Mike's hands were warm through the parka as he guided Alina toward the snowmobile. Too warm. His fingers left red marks on her forearm where they touched, not from pressure, but from some lingering heat that seeped through her layers like fever. The radio squawked again, the dispatcher's voice fraying into static. "Multiple contacts now. triangulating. The snowmobile's engine roared to life, its vibrations traveling up Eleanor's spine like an electric shock. Mike didn't seem to notice how she flinched, or how her fingers dug into the seat when the headlights swept across the pines, illuminating not tree trunks but shapes, hunched and watching from the shadows. "Easy," Mike said, mistaking her panic for hypothermia. He adjusted the parka around her shoulders, his breath frosting in the air. "We'll have you warmed up in 20 minutes. The radio crackled again. "Mike, you seeing this? Thermals are going nuts." But he flicked it off with a gloved thumb. Eleanor stared at the darkened display. The static had sounded too much like chattering teeth. They sped through the forest, snow kicking up behind them. Eleanor clung to Mike's waist, her cheek pressed against his back. His heartbeat thudded through the layers of fleece and Gore-Tex, steady, human, alive. She focused on that rhythm, drowning out the whispers that slithered between the trees. Then she smelled it, wood smoke. The snowmobile's headlight carved a trembling path through the pines, its beam catching on the reflective strips of Mike's gear. Orange, synthetic, painfully modern against Blackpine's gnawing hunger. Eleanor pressed her face into his parka, inhaling detergent and sweat instead of lye and lacerated earth. The forest blurred past, its trees leaning away from their passage like bowed penitents. Mike's radio fizzed again. This time the dispatcher's voice came through clear. "Base to Ranger Delacroix, confirm extraction complete. Over." The rescue helicopter's blades thumped overhead like a panicked heartbeat. Eleanor clutched the foil blanket tighter around her shoulders, its crinkling sound drowning out the whispers still coiled in her ears. The paramedic's lips moved. Dehydration, exposure, probable hallucinations. But the words dissolved into static before they reached her. Mike handed her a steaming paper cup. "Hot chocolate," he said, smiling like this was some winter camping mishap. The liquid smelled wrong, burnt sugar and something meaty underneath. Eleanor set it aside untouched. Outside the clinic window, snow fell in fat, lazy flakes. Normal snow. Safe snow. The kind that didn't whisper grace's meat as it landed. The doctor shone a penlight in her eyes. "Pupils still dilated," he murmured to the nurse. Eleanor wanted to laugh. If only they knew what her pupils had swallowed in Blackpine's clearing. They discharged her at dawn with a prescription for sleeping pills she'd never take. Mike drove her to the motel in silence, his truck heater blasting dry air that reeked of pine-scented deodorizer. When they pulled up to the peeling vinyl siding, he finally spoke. "Your research team's gear. We didn't find any of it." The motel bedsprings groaned under Eleanor's weight as she sat, still clutching the foil blanket from the clinic. Its metallic scent couldn't mask the lingering reek of Blackpine, lye and spoiled meat clinging to her hair, her nails, the cracks of her chapped lips. Mike hovered near the door, twisting his ranger cap in his hands. "There's, he nodded to the bathroom. "Hot water's good here." The motel shower ran for 43 minutes before Eleanor turned the tap off. Steam curled around her fingers as she wiped the fogged mirror, revealing not her reflection, but the Wendigo's single remaining eye staring back from the glass. She didn't flinch, just pressed her palm against the pupil until the steam swallowed it again. Her field notes burned easily in the motel's rusted barbecue pit. The pages curled like dying insects, their edges blackening to reveal handwritten phrases that hadn't been there when she'd penned them. "The bell's tongue is still wet and grace requires empty vessels." The fire department came when the flames leapt too high. She told them it was a grad student's failed thesis. They believed her. Boston smelled wrong after Blackpine, not the harbor brine and diesel she remembered, but something underneath, like meat left too long in a root cellar. Her colleagues at the university joked about her sabbatical in spooky woods, their laughter a brittle thing that cracked at the edges. Eleanor laughed louder than any of them, tossing back whiskey like it could scald the taste of pine resin from her tongue. Professor Hendricks from the anthropology department leaned in during the faculty mixer, his aftershave reeking of synthetic evergreen. "So what really happened up there?" he asked. winking like they shared a secret. Alina watched his pupils dilate as she described finding Blackpine's church, how the bell rope had disintegrated at her touch, how the hymnals contained recipes, not hymns. Hendrix chuckled nervously. She didn't mention the part where his face briefly melted into the minister thing's featureless stretch of flesh mid-conversation. Her apartment felt too quiet despite the traffic noise bleeding through the windows. Alina bolted the door each night with 3 deadbolts, the third one newly installed, its steel plate still shiny against the aged wood. She kept the rusted bell shard in her coat pocket, its edge worn smooth from constant fingering. Sometimes, in the dark, it vibrated faintly against her thigh like a phone set to silent. Thank you for listening to tonight's stories. If you enjoyed them, please leave a like and subscribe.